Over the next 2 videos, we're going to be previewing SwiftUI. And I want to stress preview because this is not meant to be a full-blown tutorial on SwiftUI. Like, that is an entirely different course, not just 1 or 2 videos. So I want to set those expectations, and I'm going to say it again in the next video. But anyway, like, what is SwiftUI? So as I mentioned in previous videos, SwiftUI was introduced to us just in the summer of 2019 at WWDC. So that's when it was announced. By the time it was like officially released and out of beta, it was late September of 2019. So here in early April 2020, it's only been released for 6 months. So it is very, very early in the game. And this is a fundamentally different way for us to build our UIs, not only on iOS, but across all the Apple platforms, right? macOS, iPadOS, iOS, watchOS. And I want to go back to how early we are in SwiftUI, just to stress that, because I know, especially after watching these 2 videos, you may get really excited about this and want to only learn SwiftUI. But just to reiterate what I said in the UI kit or SwiftUI, we're in a transitionary period that if you're trying to be an iOS developer in the next 2-3 years, you're gonna have to know both, again, because we are in that transition period. But before we go any further, I would recommend, especially since this course is for absolute beginners, learn one at a time. Like, it's fine to know what SwiftUI is and to like maybe play a little bit, but I don't recommend splitting your time 50-50. I would learn one and then learn the other. And I would learn UIKit first, because all those best practices in how we do things in UIKit are well established. The thing with SwiftUI, because it's so early, like for the past year, so here in June of 2020, it will be the 1-year anniversary of when SwiftUI was announced. So developers in the community have spent the past year like trying to figure it out. Like, we as a community don't know all the best practices yet, don't know what's the best way to build a SwiftUI app. And because we don't know, there's a lot of experimentation going on. The SwiftUI space is going to change drastically over the next couple years. So that's why I recommend learning UIKit first, because if you start trying to learn SwiftUI now, it's going to change and evolve so much that for a new beginner, like, that's a lot to keep up with. All right, now let's move on to like what it is and start talking about the overview. So here I have up a website from Apple. I'll link to it in the description, of course, but you can see here, introducing SwiftUI. And before we go any further, I'm sure you're going to be very interested in this. You can see this says SwiftUI tutorials in the upper left. And if you click on the right here, tutorials, you'll see a whole list of SwiftUI tutorials that Apple has created just for SwiftUI. And they're very, very well done. The community was super impressed by the SwiftUI tutorials Apple put out. Let's just say it is far and above what they usually do. So here you can see SwiftUI is a modern way to declare user interfaces for any Apple platform. Create beautiful dynamic apps faster than ever before. The key word I want to hang on here is declare, right? So let me put up this picture here so you can kind of see what's going on as I describe this. So the major fundamental difference I was talking about is in programming paradigms, right? So you have imperative programming in declarative programming. The way UIKit works is imperative. At a high level, the way imperative programming works is you tell the computer how to do something. Like, right, think back to our card workout app, like even just the view did load in our list of functions, right? We're telling the app or the computer exactly what to do and how to do it. That's why we're declaring all these functions and we're saying, run this function, then run this function, then run this function, right? We're telling it how to do things. Whereas declarative is where you kind of define or declare what you want to happen, and then the computer like figures out how to make that happen. Let me give you an example. So say you have 2 screen states, right? One is if the user's logged in, you're going to show this UI on the screen, the home screen. If the user's not logged in, you're going to show the login screen as you see here. So all you have to do with declarative UI is change the state of the screen, which is typically like an isLoggedIn variable, to on or off. And based on that variable changing, that is how the UI knows to update. It's kind of like watching that variable, that state is logged in, and then whenever you change it, it reacts to that change and automatically adapts its UI. So again, that's super high level, imperative versus declarative, but that is the fundamental difference between UIKit and SwiftUI. And I want to stress how different this paradigm is, because even experienced developers that haven't dealt with reactive programming in the past or declarative programming languages, we're all beginners. Like, this is brand new. And I've done my fair share of courses and playing with SwiftUI and learning, and it was just like being a beginner again. Like, I use this analogy, right? It's like sports. Basketball and football, yes, they are both sports. So being athletic, a fast runner, like, sure, that skill carries over. But once you get down below, basketball and football are completely different skill sets. So that's the analogy, right? Like, sure, declarative and imperative or UI kit and SwiftUI, you're still programming, so general programming skills help, but it's like playing basketball versus playing football, right? They're totally different. So, all right, let's keep running down this website. But what you're looking at here is you have the code on the left and the canvas on the right. So this isn't storyboard, even though it kind of looks like storyboard. The way this works is you kind of get the best of both worlds. You'll see in the next video when we actually build a sample app that you can either do stuff on the canvas, so it kind of feels like storyboard, and then what happens when you drop something on the canvas, it automatically populates the code over in the code. So if you're the type that just prefers, typing out the code, no canvas, cool, you can do that. If you're the type that likes to be visual and drag and drop on the canvas, that will work too. And then when you drag it on the canvas, it'll spit out the code. It's actually kind of crazy. And again, you'll see that in the next video. So the canvas here is an amazing part of SwiftUI. Again, you'll see it in action in a bit. Let's keep it moving. So describe your layout just once. This is what we're talking about with declarative. It says declare the content and layout for any state of your view. SwiftUI knows when that state changes and updates your view's rendering to match. And just as an example, like, see this table view on the right? I'm scrolling up, it won't scroll up any higher. I know that the non-vertical centering bothers me too, but it won't do it. See, I'm moving this, it's not moving. Anyway, this code right here, this is all the code it took to populate this table view. Now we've built a table view in our colors app. Remember all that, we had to set the delegates, we had to put the table view on the screen, we had to set the constraints to declare it. None of that, right? There's no constraints in SwiftUI. And let's walk through this code real quick to give you an idea. Now, don't worry if you don't get it. We're actually going to dive into the code in the next video, but I'll walk you through this. So this list is basically our table view, right? A list. Look at the screen. It's a list. So what an H stack is a horizontal stack view. And you can see what's inside the H stack is the image, the text, and a spacer, and then another image. Let's walk through that. So the first image, where it's landmark.thumbnail, you see is this tree right here. The text, the landmark name, is Turtle Rock. The spacer is the space in between Turtle Rock and the star. And then you can see here's an if statement that, hey, if the landmark is marked as a favorite, then show the star. So you build this H stack, which is a view of horizontally stacked other views. So again, the horizontal stack is the image on the left, the text right next to the image, put a spacer in between, and then have the star on the right if it's marked a favorite. And then all the table view is a list of those views. So this whole table view is built in just this little bit of code. Of course, except for the data, right? Like landmark.thumbnail, like all that code is in a data model somewhere. But the actual UI code for the table view, like this is it. Like it's actually pretty amazing. And like I said, we're going to build one in the next video. Simplify your animations. We're not going to see this in the example. Again, this is not a huge, thorough tutorial, but animations are super, super easy in SwiftUI as well. And then you saw this, the Xcode, you see it live. What they mean by live is, you remember when we were building like our other apps, if we wanted to see the changes, we had to run it. Okay, pull up the simulator, cool, now we play with it. Well, as you're making changes, the canvas updates live. And even if you're running your app and you change the title, like it updates live. And again, we'll see that in action in the next video, but that is a great productivity win for development, right? Because you remember what it was like, right? We would make a change, all right, let's run it. Oh, that was broke. Okay, make the change, run it again. That takes a long time. All right, keep it moving. Okay, this is other stuff. But yeah, I highly recommend checking out this page. And the great thing that I forgot to mention is when you use these elements like this list, the reason it is a list and it is kind of generic, if you will, is because when you make a list like this, it translates that into whatever platform you're on. So for example, a list on a watch looks a lot different than this list. But because you've declared it like list, it's going to adapt for you, right? So by using SwiftUI, it goes across all the Apple platforms, right? Mac OS, watchOS. So it's a great way to kind of write the code once, and then you get all those other layouts. You don't have to create a full-blown separate Mac app. Again, that is high level. If you're converting an iOS app to a Mac app, there is some stuff you need to do. Of course, I'm not just saying it automatically transfers, but building it in SwiftUI does a lot of the heavy lifting for you. So to reiterate, before we move on to actually building something in SwiftUI, we're still very early. I know it's exciting to want to go learn SwiftUI, but as a beginner, you're going to be much better off learning UIKit first, because SwiftUI is still so early, so nascent that things are going to change rapidly. Like, I don't know what's coming at WWDC in a couple months, but I'm expecting some big changes for SwiftUI, just like there was from Swift 1 to Swift 2 and Swift 2 to Swift 3. Like, Swift changed a lot during that time period. We're all expecting the same to happen with SwiftUI. So again, my recommendation is let us sort out SwiftUI first and then kind of come over and learn it, but definitely like take some time to play around with it. Again, my one big advice, don't split your time 50-50, right? Focus on UIKit first. That's what I would do if I was starting right now. In this SwiftUI preview, we're going to build this table view, which has my thumbnails and the YouTube video title and the date it was uploaded, and it's going to be in a table view. I'm going to show you how to build that in SwiftUI. Now, again, I stress SwiftUI preview, not SwiftUI beginner tutorial, because again, I know I've said this before, but I will reiterate. Explaining all the basics of SwiftUI, like that would be 10, 15 more videos. Like that's an entire other course. Good news, I plan on releasing that course by the end of 2020. Why so long? Why the end of the year? Because it is April of 2020 right now. Well, like I said in the previous video, I'm expecting big changes at WWDC this summer, and then it's got to go through beta and won't be officially released until fall of 2020. So that is why the end of the year, the SwiftUI course will come out. So if you're super interested in SwiftUI, stay tuned for that. But this is just a preview. Because again, the whole point of this course was just to expose you to the whole world and show you what exists and give you the high level concepts, right? But you will be able to follow along and type along with me and have this end result. I just may not stop and break down every little super basic thing. So again, feel free to follow along, but this is not meant to be a comprehensive, you understand every aspect of SwiftUI video. All right, that disclaimer out of the way, let's get started. Here we go. Open up Xcode. New project. Something's going to be different now. Single view app, that's fine. Now, we're going to call this SwiftUI videos. So I'm going to call it. And Sean Allen, put your information in there as always. Language is Swift. Here's the big deal. Not storyboard, SwiftUI. There we go. Hit next. Create. Oh, I guess one thing, might be a little too late now. SwiftUI does require Xcode 11 and macOS Catalina. So if you're not on macOS Catalina or you're not on Xcode 11, just watch the video. You can't type along. So that is one of the downsides of also, focusing on SwiftUI is that it requires all the latest and greatest equipment. And if somebody wants to use your app that uses SwiftUI, they have to be on iOS 13, which might not be that big of a deal, but disclaimers nonetheless. All right, my canvas is loading up. There it is. It's awfully big. Let's minimize it. Let's actually minimize this right pane. We're not going to need that. Again, I want to make sure my environment is good. Okay. So here we are. As you can see, hello world. I'm going to click on that and you see it automatically highlighted the code here on line 13 and put a nice little red box around that. You'll notice there's no constraints. There's no label, right? It just knows where to put it. Now to start building this up piece by piece, instead of hello world, let's put in video title so you can see what that is. This is what we're going to start building. Now, below it, as you saw on the design here, we have our video title and then we have the date below it. So we're going to need another text right below it. So 2 options here. We're going to do it the quick way, and then I'll show you how you can do it just by typing it out too. So remember I said earlier, you can do a lot of stuff on the canvas and it'll put the code in automatically. That is how you may want to start out because that is how you're going to learn basically how SwiftUI is working, what the modifiers are. But once you have done SwiftUI for a while and you have things memorized, you're probably going to be a lot faster typing. So just know that that's probably going to be your evolution of using SwiftUI. Start on the canvas and then eventually shift over to typing. So we're going to start with the canvas. Just like on Storyboard, hit the plus button up here and you can see you have a whole list of stuff here. So let's type in text. That's what we want. So if I drag text onto here and you can see, hold the button and you can see like a solid red line and look right below my canvas here. Add text in a new vertical stack. If I move it to the left, add text in a new horizontal stack. Same thing above it, add text to a new vertical stack. So a big thing with SwiftUI is V stacks and H stacks and Z stacks. So V stack is a vertical stack. An H stack is a horizontal stack, like I explained in the previous video, how their cell was horizontal. And then a Z stack is like layers on top of each other, right? Not to the left of it or to the bottom of it, like right on top of it. That's the Z stack. So we want to add this to a vertical stack right below it. So you can see how you have this solid red line here. Let go, and you're going to get the text below it. See, placeholder. Now look what it did to my code. It added the text here, and it automatically wrapped my 2 labels in a V stack, right? All by just dropping that onto the canvas. It fills in the code, like I said. Now you can kind of see, like, if you already knew you wanted a V stack with 2 labels in it, you probably could have typed this out faster than like dragging it and dropping it. So hopefully that illustrates what I'm talking about. Is you may start off on the canvas, but as you get better with SwiftUI, you'll migrate to actually just typing it. So we don't want this to say placeholder. We want this to say date uploaded, right? Okay. Now let's look here. They're kind of close here, like right. They're kind of squished together. But if I click on this VStack, you can see. So the VStack is only going to fill up as much space as it needs. So that introduces me to the concept of a spacer. So spacer will fill up like the rest of the space. So if in this VStack, I type a spacer down here, watch what happens. It shoves everything up to the top. Because what you're looking at in this VStack is you have one text label at the top, another text for date uploaded, and then the rest of all this space on the phone is the spacer, right? So same thing, if I put the spacer in between the text, now look, boom, it split it up, top and bottom. So again, the VStacks fill up the entire, not necessarily the entire phone all the time, because again, you can have VStacks inside of VStacks inside of an HStack. Like there's layers to this stuff. But that is the basics of what like a spacer does. Now, we can add a modifier to the spacer. Oh, we're getting crazy. So let's do that here. We can do .frame, and then you can see we can give it a whole frame, width, height, whatever. We just want to give it a height. So I can actually like delete all these other ones. And the frame of my spacer, I want to give a height, is going to be 5, right? So you see now I just added a little bit of space in between video title and date uploaded. Now you may notice in our design, those are aligned left. Those aren't centered like they are right now. So if I click on my VStack, and here's the cool thing, if you command click on your VStack, and you can do this in code, watch, I command click, I get this menu, and hit show SwiftUI inspector, like this is the cool thing. You're gonna get all this stuff, right? So alignment, like we want this to be aligned left. So let's click on that, alignment, and look at my canvas. They align left instead of centered. Watch, I'm gonna hit them align right. Bam, they aligned right, centered, cool. And then, like I said, this is when you can start learning your modifiers, right? So here's the frame, padding, and you can add modifier. Now watch what happens when I click this. It gets crazy. You can see, look at all the, there it goes. I was hoping it got big like that. Look at all these modifiers. So this is what I was talking about, how using the canvas to help you learn these, before you have all these like memorized. But once you have them memorized, like I said, you can just type it out real quick. So these are all the different modifiers you can do. We're not going to add a modifier to this just yet. We just wanted to make sure our VStack was leading aligned, so they align left. Next, we want to add our image. Again, if you look at the design, the thumbnail image is to the left of our date and title. So our title and date are in a VStack by themselves. However, we want to put the picture to the left, so that would be an HStack, right? The left side of the HStack is my image. The right side of the HStack is the VStack that holds my title and date uploaded. So remember I said you can have HStacks inside of VStacks, inside of HStacks, like again, there's levels, but if you just picture the boxes and the items in the boxes, that should help you out. So we want to add an image. So hit the plus button, type image. Oh, I got to spell it right. Image, okay? Again, drag it onto your canvas. Now, again, we can add it in a vertical stack. That's not what we want to do, right? We want to put it on the left, and you see you get that solid red line, and it'll say add image to a new horizontal stack along the existing vertical stack, right? It tells you exactly what's going to happen. So we drop the image there. Well, there is no image because we don't have an image name. Okay, let's actually upload our images now. So I have these prepared, but I'm going to link to these images in the description so you can download them. But just like before, click on your assets folder, go to your finder that has the images. Here's 12 thumbnails of mine. Going to drag them in here. Cool. And we'll pick 9090 as our first. You see the name here. Let me click on it. 9090. That'll be the name of our image. So go back to the content view. Image name 90-90. Sometimes your automatic preview will get paused. If you just hit resume, that'll pop back up. Okay, not the desired effect, huh? Our image is huge. So to make our image fit, we want to give it a modifier. We want to give it the resizable modifier. So you can do image.resizable, and watch this update here. Well, maybe hit resume. Okay, still not the desired effect. What that did was that squeezed it into our HStack, right? You see the right side of our HStack is still our title and our date uploaded. The left side of our HStack is the giant picture, but it did squeeze it so it only fit on the left side. So what we want to tell it to do now is to keep the same aspect ratio, right? It's a 16:9. Make sure you keep the same aspect ratio, and that'll make it look better. And to do that, we can do .scaled to fit. scales the view to fit its parent, bam. We keep our aspect ratio there. Our image is a little big, right? It dominates the whole H stack, right? It's taken up like 60% of it. And again, if you look at our design, it's not, it's smaller. So what we can do here is also assign a frame to the image. Now you see me typing code, like I'm just kind of used to that. But again, what I can do is if I command click on the 90-90 rule image and say show SwiftUI inspector, you can see I can do my modifiers from here as well. So frame, I want to give a height. I want to give a height of 90. So I do that and I hit return. Look, it gave me a frame of 90 here right on line 16. And here you notice that's still not what we want. So order matters. This is kind of the biggest learning curve with SwiftUI. These are all called modifiers, by the way, what you can put on there. And the order of your modifiers matter. So you're going to see sometimes you just put some things in the wrong order and that doesn't give you the behavior you want. So like I said, I put the frame before scale to fit and that didn't give me the behavior. After scale to fit, now that's starting to look a little more like what we want. And the last thing we're missing from this is the corner radius. So again, command click on the picture. There's tons of different ways, right? I could just type dot corner radius, right? And then of 8. Bam. Like I said, once you know it, typing it is going to be so much quicker. But because you're a beginner, I want to show you, let me delete corner radius. I want to show you how to use the canvas because that's how you're going to learn and memorize all these modifiers. So hit show SwiftUI inspector. You can scroll down, add modifier. You see our whole list of modifiers, right? And then we're going to look for corner radius. That's what we're looking for here. Okay, cool. Corner radius. Let's add that. And you saw here, it gave me the code, right? It spit the code in here. It defaulted to 3. We're going to make it 8. That's what the design wanted. So now our image here is looking, let me kind of click off of this so it doesn't highlight in red. It's looking kind of like what we want. One thing I'm noticing here is the first is our video and title and our image are just squeezed a little bit too close together. So let's put a spacer in between them, right? So you see our H stack here. So you see the image is on the left side of the H stack and then our V stack is on the right. Well, in between them, let's add a spacer. And okay, remember the view fills up the whole screen. Well, you see by putting a spacer in the middle, it pushed the text all the way to the right and the image all the way to the left. So that's not quite what we want either. So again, remember how I gave the spacer down here a frame? Well, I can do the same thing. So I'm just going to Command V or copy and paste that, and not a height. We don't want a height on the spacer. We want a width, right? Because we're in the horizontal stack. So let's make the width 16. Again, this is just based on design. Okay, so that's good, proper spacing that I want. Now to avoid confusion, you may notice how I'm just typing this list of modifiers here, and it's like a vertical stacking list, right? Like this. But on the spacer, I just did dot frame. So if I only have one thing I'm adding to the spacer, I like to put it on one line. And this is pure stylistic choice, by the way. However, obviously, if you have 4 of them, it makes sense to put it on multiple lines rather than doing like image.resizable.scale-to-fit.frame like all on one line. That becomes very hard to read. So again, if I only have one thing, I like to put it on one line. Now let's play around with the text here. Instead of video title, let's actually put the name of this. So say the 90-90 rule. And I'm testing like how this label works. So the 90-90 rule is a great rule. I'm seeing how this works. You see how it's spaced and gave me a live update. Let's add some modifiers to this text. So this is our title. So let's give it a font weight. So as you can imagine, there is a dot font weight modifier here. And again, you could do the same thing. You could click on your canvas, find the modifier, drag it onto the canvas. Again, I'm just quicker typing, kind of the habit. So again, if you hit dot, here's your font weights, bold, heavy, whatever. We're going to do semi-bold for this title. And then we want to limit the lines because watch, if I kept writing, the 90-90 rule is a great rule. It is so awesome. I'm going to misspell this, whatever. It should be 3 lines. Like you can see, our label just keeps growing and growing and growing. Well, we want to limit this to 2 lines because again, our title shouldn't be that long. So we can do that. Dot line limit makes sense, 2. So that way it's always going to be just 2 lines. And then you can do dot minimum scale factor, 0.25. This means like, hey, if you get to that line limit of 2 and you still have more words, you can shrink the size of the font up until 25%. That's actually pretty low. We're going to make this like 75%. That way it only shrinks a little bit before truncating rather than making like a size 4 font that you can't even read. And then similarly onto our date uploaded, again, let's just put a sample date in here so we can get to like really see what this looks like. January 23rd, 2020. That's not the real date, but we want to see it. So we want to give this a different font or a font type here. So font, and we want to do dot sub headline. Again, you can do different like call out, footnotes, caption, large title. Sub headline makes it a little bit smaller, and we can also give it a color. So dot foreground color, and we want to do dot secondary. So again, these are the system UI colors that'll change via dark mode and light mode. A secondary color, right? It kind of makes sense. The primary color is like the big bold black on a white screen, or it'll be white on a dark screen. The secondary color will be a little bit lighter, as you can see here on our canvas of January 23rd. So that is how we want to format our text. Now, you may notice we're pinned all the way to the edge on the picture and pinned all the way to the edge on the text, right? There's no padding there. Well, when we put this into our list or our table view, that's going to take care of that for us. Now, watch this, right? So here's our H-stack, right? Our H-stack embodies this entire view we just created, right? With the image that we formatted on the left side of the H-stack. There's a small little spacer in the middle to give us that padding. And then we have a V-stack on the right of the H-stack that holds our text. Well, watch. If I do Command click on the H-stack, look at this. Embed in list. Bam, table view. Embed in list, you get a table view. Of course, we got to format it and change it, but now we have a table view. Like, that's crazy. And you can see here, the list is 0 up until 5. So that's going to give us 5 images, but you can imagine if we change that to 0 ... up until, 20, that'll give us 20 of them. As you can see, our canvas filled. And then if we run it, this little play button here will run your preview. So hit that, and now you're getting essentially a simulator here once the preview is done loading, that you can actually interact with and use on your app. So here we are. Look, I'm now scrolling up like that. That was like, what, 20 items? Again, so our basic table view, like we literally just built a view, command clicked it and said, put it in a table view, and it did it. Like, that's crazy. And now if we're scrolling down here, you notice it's going right up to the top of the screen. What if we want like a navigation bar up top? Well, that's pretty simple too. Now we want to wrap our list inside a navigation view. So up here, I'm going to type in navigation view. You saw it right there. Open and close brackets. So this can get tricky sometimes with SwiftUI, I'm not gonna lie, like where the brackets go. So if you go left and right over the bracket on your arrow keys, you can see it's highlighting the list bracket up there in yellow. So I need a bracket below this for the item view. And here's another neat little trick. If you highlight your whole struct, do Control-I, it like lines up everything for you, the alignment here. So here we have a navigation view. We broke our preview. Let's stop running that because we like changed code. But you can see at the top now, we have like a navigation bar because we put it in a navigation view. And then now on our list, we can give a navigation title for what we want this list to be called. So I can do dot navigation bar title, as you can see here. And then we got to pass in a text of Sean's videos. And you see it's updating live on our preview. And the tricky thing that caught me off guard too is you would think this navigation bar title would be the dot on the navigation view, right? If I go back and forth on this curly brace, you can see this is the navigation view curly brace. Well, you have to put this navigation bar title on this list here. So little note in case you messed that up. But now let's run our preview again. And now look, you see our nav bar at the top. As we're scrolling up, we get Sean's videos at the top, just like that. Super simple. And look, I'm running my app, right? It's running like on the simulator. Let's say I want to change Sean's videos to Sean's videos part 4. Look, it updated right. We're still live. The navigation bar updated. Part 3, not part 4, whatever. You get the idea. So yeah, we're updating this live, and it was super quick to create this table view. And you see when we put this in the table view, it gave us some of the default padding here on the left. Remember before it was in the table view? Okay, I'm going to call it table view by accident, but it's really called a list now. So that's going to be an old habit to die hard here. But you can see on the left, we get the padding. That's because we put it into a list, and SwiftUI knows like what a list should look like. And it has the built-in padding, built-in margins. Like we got everything for free. Like that's the power of SwiftUI. We have our list of videos, but they're all the same video. Let's actually put some data in this here. So for that, we're going to create a new file in your folder. Command N. We're going to create kind of our data model here. Swift file, call this video, hit create. I'm going to drag this up here. And here's where we're going to create a struct for our model here. We want to do struct video. We want to create a video object here. That video object has 3 properties, right? It has a var image name. We're just going to get the name of the image, which that is a string. It also has a var title. We'll say video now. It's title. That is also a string. And it has a upload date, which is also a string that we're going to put in there. So that's our video object. again, back to our content view, you can see we're going to have an image name that we're going to create an image out of. We have to pass in a title, and we have to pass in an upload date, right? So that's our video. Now, in order for our list here to use our video object, it has to conform to a protocol called identifiable. So identifiable, that's how it knows what it is. And when you're identifiable, you have to have a, see, look, it says video does not conform to protocol identifiable. It's because we have to have a ID variable. So we'll do var ID, and that equals a UUID, and we'll initialize a new one. UUID stands for universally unique identifier. So anytime we create a video, you see we're initializing a new one. So we're initializing a brand new UUID for this specific video object. So this is the basic object of a video. Now let's create some dummy data. So we'll do that here, struct video list. And this would be the equivalent, like maybe let's say we're downloading our video list, but we're kind of mocking that data here. And I'm actually going to copy and paste this because you would watch me type for the next 15 minutes doing this. Maybe not 15 minutes. I'm selling myself short on my typing skills, but let me copy and paste this in. You can pause the video and type it in as well, but I don't want to bore you just watching me type this out. You'll see it's a bit. All right, paste. So there you go. I have a static variable called top 12 of my videos. So this is 12 videos. You can see here on line 20, we're initializing a video with an image name, 37 tips. There should actually be a space here. Option drag space. There we go. It has a title. There's my title that we're passing in. It has an upload date that we're passing in. Like I said, I manually typed in all this data. In a real app, we'd probably be downloading this from the internet. But again, this is our mock data that we're going to use to populate our table view. So back to our content view, we have to update our content view a little bit. So not as part of this body. You'll notice this is a variable called body that is a view. Like our whole screen is like a view. So we don't want to mess with that variable. We want to create a new one. So var videos, and you see that is of type an array of video, and that is going to equal an empty array right now. So you see in this down here in the list on line 17, instead of 0 through 20, very similar to how number of rows in section when we built our table view, how we could either pass in a hard-coded number. Remember we did 50 for the colors app, or we could pass in, colors.count to give it whatever was in the array. It's very similar to what we're doing here by passing in videos to our list. That is saying however many number of videos are in this array, that is how many cells we should have. And then now item, this is just a renaming. Item will still work, but that doesn't make as much sense if we called it video. Right? Not video, it's just video. So basically this is kind of like a for loop, right? Like for every video in videos, do all this stuff. So instead of the image, instead of passing in 9090, we're going to pass in video. Again, this video that we have here as it iterates through video.image name. There we go. Xcode was not behaving. Sometimes that happens, especially in SwiftUI. Again, super new. So video.image name. Same thing down here with the text. We're just replacing the hard-coded stuff with whatever video is in the list here. So we want to do video.title. And same thing down here with the upload date, video.upload date. Not getting autocomplete, not sure why. Okay, cool. So we've replaced all of our hard-coded stuff with whatever video we pass in, which again is in this array of videos, which we created, again, if you remember down here on our struct called video list, we created an array called top 12, which has our 12 videos in it. So again, back to content view, let's run this on our preview. All right, hit resume here. Now it's running on the preview. Empty table view. We lost everything. What did we do? Well, think about it. It's a blank table view because, we changed all this stuff. We haven't told this array of videos what's in it, right? Like it's an empty array. So here in this preview struct, this is what actually generates the preview here on the right. You'll notice content view will now be able to take in a parameter, right? Because we have a variable called videos on our content view. So watch, if I just delete the initializer there, open it up, you see now we get a parameter called videos that we can pass in. So what this is saying is, hey, show my preview, but pass in an array of videos to my content view. And again, content view is this whole thing we've been working on. So what array do we want to pass into our content view? We want to give our content view video list.top12, right? Again, just to reiterate, and you see, look at that, immediately updated, bam, and it's running. Like I can scroll and everything. So you see the power of SwiftUI and how fast things load. And you see based on the array we created here, with the image name, the title, the upload date on all those videos, that is populating here. You see we get 37 tips for junior software developers. And you can scroll down through, some of my recent videos here. You see we get the video image, we get the title, we get the upload date, Again, so you saw, yeah, it took a little bit of time because I was explaining everything and going slow, but we just built this table view with a custom cell very quickly. And then again, look, like here's all the code. Like, of course, we had our data model over here. Like that's a little bit of code, of course, but the UI code, not a lot. So there you have a quick SwiftUI preview. Again, you can see it's vastly different. It's a fundamentally different way to program your UI than what we're used to with UIKit. But that was a preview. I would say happy to answer any questions in the comments, but to be honest with you, I've only done the very, very basic layer of SwiftUI. So if you have very deep questions, feel free to ask them and hit up the Slack as well. I'm just not going to promise I'm going to answer them. However, like I said, my whole year after this course is released as of April is dedicated to SwiftUI because I have a product in mind that I'm going to build fully in SwiftUI and Catalyst and have it be across all platforms. So yeah, so the next 8 months, 100% SwiftUI for me. And then, like I said, by the end of the year, have a pretty basic beginner course on SwiftUI. But anyway, that's it. I'm pretty excited for the future of iOS development, which is clear that's going to be SwiftUI. Again, we're just not there yet. And even if you're super excited about this, I would definitely learn UIKit first. And again, like I said, SwiftUI is going to go through a phase over the next year or two of constant changes, and we're figuring it out. But anyway, that's the preview. Hope you enjoyed it. On to the next video. So many times when I was just learning, I remember hearing about a concept and being like, I didn't even know that was a thing. Like, I didn't know that existed. Well, that is what this section is meant to help out with. As I've said many times, the goal of this course is to expose you to this world. So I don't want you to be overwhelmed by these topics. We're going to talk about how most apps typically work, between a server and a client, right? For example, if you're on Twitter, your tweets got to live somewhere and that's off on the server. We're going to explain how that process works. We're going to talk about version control, which is essentially, a save state for your code base, and it allows development teams to work together. We're also going to talk about third-party libraries, how you can bring in like a module of other people's code into your program. And then we're also going to talk about various career paths a developer can take, right? You can go big company, you can be a freelancer. We're going to dive into that. Now, as I've said before, the whole goal of this course is to just expose you to this world. So please don't feel overwhelmed when you're watching these videos that you don't know this stuff. The concepts in these videos could be entire courses in and of themselves. And again, I don't want to overwhelm you, but like I said, I want to let you know that this exists. So don't worry if you don't fully get all these concepts yet. These are things that you will learn later on in your journey. They're not really for absolute beginners. But again, like I said, so many times I was like, I didn't even know this existed. Well, again, in this section, we're trying to fix that problem. So how do most apps work? Obviously, it's a pretty broad question and could be 20 courses in and of itself to explain everything. So of course, we're going to keep this high level, simple, and we're going to talk about apps that deal with the server and client dynamic, which again is most apps. First, let's simply define, server and the client. So the server is something you may think of as like the cloud, and the client is either your phone, your iPad, maybe your iMac, your laptop. Like that is the client. So for example, let's take Twitter, right? Your tweets, they live in Twitter servers, right? They live off in the cloud. However, when you open up your phone and pull up Twitter, the server sends all those tweets and all that information to your phone, the client, and then the client, processes that information and displays it on the phone. So again, all the data lives on the server, right? All the tweets, all that stuff. And then you have to have Wi-Fi or a cellular connection to pull that down from the server. So why I reiterated that is because I want to talk about that data that gets passed. Typically, it's via JSON, JSON, or JavaScript Object Notation. Here on the screen, you can see a very simplified JSON of what a tweet might be, right? You can see who tweeted it, you can see the tweet message, you can see when they tweeted it. And I say this is an overly simplified version of a tweet because a tweet is going to have a lot more data, right? You have like the avatar, if the tweet has a video or an image, you got all the people that liked it, all the people that retweeted it. So again, this is just a super simplified version to illustrate the point. So what gets sent from the server, again, the cloud, to your phone or your iPad or your computer is a list of these JSON objects that are the tweets. So the client's job, which is again, the phone, the iPad, the computer, is to take this JSON, parse through it, and make it look pretty on the screen, right? Like the running joke is that 90% of iOS development is just hitting a server, parsing the JSON, making it look pretty on the screen. And it's not far from the truth. Like this is a core fundamental skill in iOS development. This is called networking. However, networking isn't something super beginner developers need to learn. Even though it's a fundamental skill, it's something you're going to learn later on in your journey. But again, just knowing the fundamentals of the server, the client, seeing this JSON that you have to parse to make look pretty on the screen, just knowing that at a high level gives you a head start when it comes time to learn networking. Because ask any developer that's gone through this journey, networking is one of the more difficult things to learn, and it always trips people up, especially parsing through the JSON. Now again, not all apps have this server client dynamic. Like some apps, typically games, all live on your phone. So if you ever had an app where if you deleted the app, you lost all the information on the app, that means no data was living on a server. All the data was living on the client, which is the phone, the iPad, the computer. So that's a different dynamic. But again, most apps, the Facebooks, the Instagrams, the Twitters, like most apps have data on a server, right? Because in this day and age, you want to be able to log onto your iPad and get the same data that you can log onto your computer and get, right? A lot of stuff lives in the cloud, so to speak. So again, this server client dynamic, again, is fundamental knowledge. And I oversimplified this just to be clear, because again, this course is about just exposing you to this and teaching you just the very fundamentals. So when it comes time to learn this networking, like you have the fundamental knowledge of how it all works. Now you just need to learn the implementation details. All right, as always, if you have questions, hit me up in the comments or in Slack. See you in the next video. Now let's talk about what is an API. First of all, it stands for Application Programming Interface. And there's two very common ways that you will use them as an iOS developer. The first is for making network calls. As I explained in a previous example, right, the Twitter and the server going down to the client of the phone. There's an API involved there. We'll talk about that in a second. And the second way you use them is Apple's own APIs, right? Like we talked about earlier in the course, how, Apple has laid down this foundation and we're building on top of that foundation. Well, how we interact with that foundation is via APIs, or the Application Programming Interface. Let's dive into those two examples. So back to our Twitter example of how all the tweets live on Twitter server and our client requests the information to give me the list of tweets to show your Twitter feed. Well, the client doesn't reach into the server itself and grab them. The server has an API, and the client communicates with the API. It requests information, and the API on that server is what handles those requests and also sends the information it needs. So again, our client isn't going directly into the server and grabbing the information. The client deals with the API sends back the information. Now, an API on a server, they're all over the place. Sometimes they're open, meaning any developer can access them. Sometimes the API is closed, like in the Twitter example, only Twitter developers can access that Twitter API for specific stuff. Sometimes they're free, just open to anybody to use. Often those are what's called rate limited, which means you can only send up a certain amount of requests. Sometimes it's per second, sometimes it's per hour, sometimes it's per day, depending on the API, but they limit how much you can use it. And sometimes APIs charge, right? They've done a lot of work gathering this data. They've built their server, they've built their API. And if you want to use it, you have to pay for it per a certain number of requests typically. So there's a wide variety of APIs you can use. In fact, I'm going to link in the description. There's a resource with a bunch of free APIs. I'm actually going to attach my YouTube video that I did about it too on this lesson. So go ahead and watch that video and then check out that link to see a bunch of free APIs. And the cool thing about looking at those APIs is you can get a peek at what the JSON looks like. Remember, the JSON was the JavaScript object notation. Well, you can see if you have an idea for an app, you can kind of see if there's an API out there that will give you the information you need. And then you can even look at the JSON, okay, here's what I'm going to get back from this API. Does this have all the information I need? And if the answer is yes, cool, you can use that API and build your app. So that's the example of using the API, as a way to communicate with a server to get information. Now let's talk about the example of using Apple's APIs to build your apps. As I mentioned in the beginning of this video, Apple laid the foundation and we interact with that foundation via the API. Here's an example, right? We can do view.backgroundColor equals green. That's all we have to do to make a green background. We don't have to actually write the code to make the green color show up on the screen, right? All we have to do is interact with the API saying view.backgroundColor equals green, and then all of Apple's code will actually do what it takes to make green show up on the screen, right? We don't actually have to do all that. Another example that we've used previously in this course is when we sorted our ages array, when we were learning about arrays, right? All we had to do was ages.sort, right? That is us interacting with Apple's APIs. We didn't have to write a sorting algorithm to actually sort the array, right? That's all Apple's magic code. We're just interacting with their API and just saying, hey, ages.sort, and we're done. So those are basic examples of how Apple has done a lot of the heavy lifting to make it very easy for us developers to build our apps. Again, we're interacting with their APIs for them to do all the heavy lifting. And all the frameworks have the APIs, right? There's the core location, MapKit, ARKit, right? Like these all have APIs that we can interact with, right? When we interact with MapKit, we're not building a map, you know what I mean? Like the map's already there. We're just interacting with it via the API. So now hopefully when you hear a developer say like, oh, is there an API for that? Like they're probably meaning the server type API because they want to know if they can hit that API to get the information they need. Or you may hear an iOS developer say something like, oh, I really love the SpriteKit API. What they're saying is they like the set of tools Apple has given us in order to work with SpriteKit. So anyway, those are the two most common ways you're going to use an API. Again, application programming interface, vital fundamental knowledge. Hope you enjoyed. On to the next video. All right, version control. What is that? Let me preface this by saying this is a big and complex topic, but again, as you've heard me say time and time again, we're just going to scratch the surface just so you know what it is. So again, if you feel overwhelmed, don't worry about it. You'll learn much more about this along your journey, but it is a vital skill that you're going to have to know before you get a job and work on a team. Because like I said, all development teams use this. It's at the core of development. So what is it? Well, one use is that it's essentially a save state for your code base. Let me use a video game example that I think many can relate with. Do you remember playing a video game and before you got to a big boss or maybe a really hard part in the game, you would save? And then that way you could die on the boss, or if you lost one of your key weapons, or if you just really messed up, you could always go back to that save state and try again. That's essentially what version control does with your code base. Let's use another example from Luna, like this slide up card with a chart. Like that's a pretty big feature. And you can imagine if you're writing code without a save state, like I may not know how to build that feature right away. There's probably a lot of experimentation on getting things to work right. So if I was just working on my code base and I realized halfway through, like, oh man, I really messed this up. Like, how do you unwind that? How do you go back? Well, again, version control can let you like have a save state. So basically what I would do before building this feature is I would be like, all right, let me save my progress right here. There's an actual word for it called commit. More on that later. But just to keep it in normal people's terms, have my save state right before I tackle this big feature. That way, if I just mess up my code base completely, no big deal. I can go back to that save state right before I started that. So back to that word commit. So that's the lingo, right? We don't call it a save state. You say, all right, I'm going to commit my code, and then now that's the save state, and now I can mess up my code base entirely, and I can always go back to that commit. The cool thing is you're making a ton of commits all throughout your code base as you're building your product, and you can go back to any commit, right? So you can unwind it back to 6 commits before. Like again, let's say, you've written this huge feature and you've been committing along the way, and then you realize, oh crap, I messed up, or maybe we don't really want this feature. Again, you can go back any number of commits to specific save states. And that's a nice insurance feature, because I know when I first started coding, I was so worried that I was going to mess up the code base, like I was going to break it. Well, the beauty of version control is, for the most part, like you can't break your code base, because again, you can always unwind it. Don't get me wrong, sometimes unwinding it and doing all that stuff is a giant headache, but for the most part, it's always possible. So that was a very simplified example of, keeping save states of your code base along the way. Now let's talk about how development teams use this to build their products, right? You ever wondered how big companies have development teams of 10 to 20 developers all working on the same code base and how all that works? Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about Git and GitHub. Maybe you've heard of these things. First thing, and I didn't know this for a while, but like Git and GitHub are not the same thing. So let's talk about what they are. Git is version control that runs on your local machine. Let's define some terms real quick too, local and remote. Local means it's on your computer, right? Anything you have locally, let's say you threw your computer into a lake. Well, you're going to lose all that data because it was locally on your machine. Whereas remote lives on a server somewhere. So you could throw your computer in a machine, but you got your code base remotely up on a server. So just buy a new computer and download that code base and you're good to go. Okay, so that's local and remote. And again, Git is the version control on your local machine. GitHub is an online server to put your Git repositories up on the server. And real quick, there are other services like Bitbucket that kind of do the same thing as GitHub. Those are kind of niche. GitHub is the dominant player in the space. So a simplified example of how development works with Git and GitHub. I'm writing my code base on my local machine. I build my feature or my save state, my commit. I want to send that commit up to GitHub so it lives on the remote repository. And again, you want it on that remote repository. That way you can pull down that code base on any machine, right? Say you have a work laptop or a personal laptop, or you're working between a laptop and a desktop computer. It's all the same, right? Because the code base lives remotely in the cloud and you can pull that down to any machine, right? And that's what GitHub does. GitHub stores those repositories. Now let's talk about how development teams use this to collaborate on one project. Now, again, I'm going to give a very simplified example because this can get very complex. Like I said, you have development teams of 20 to 50 to even 100 people working on one code base. So you can understand that that can get very, very complex. But again, just the simplified version, just so you have an idea of how it works. Here we go. So the power of Git is a concept called branching. So let's walk through a visual example so you'll understand this. So typically you have a master branch. And let's say we're working on the version 5 of Twitter. So on this master branch is always the version that's on the App Store. And the reason you want that is because if a user has a bug or bugs pop up, you want to be able to go to the version of the code base that the users are actually using. So that's typically master. Now, of course, we're on version 5. We want to eventually get to version 5.1 or 5.2. So we need to be able to work on the code base, but not affect the master branch that the users are actually using. So this is, again, where you branch off of master. And again, typically the first branch off is called something like dev or development. So again, the very simplified example, we branch off development, we do all of our work on development that is going to go into version 6, and then when version 6 is ready, we merge development into master. Now master is on version 6, and that's when we push that version to the App Store. And now that version 6 is on the App Store, that's what the master branch is, and then we continue that cycle all over again. For version 7, we got to branch off onto dev, do all of our work, merge it back in for version 7. Now let's expand on this example a little bit because I just kind of, waved my hand over what was going on the dev branch. Let's actually zoom into the dev branch and talk about what happens between version 5 and 6, right? Because remember, I just said we do all of our version 6 work and then we merge it back in. Well, let's zoom in on that. Now remember, we talked about working on a team. So different developers can branch off of this dev branch. So let's say I want to build a feature where I'm building the chart, and another developer wants to build a feature where they're implementing new changes to the profile screen. So once we have the dev branch, I will branch off of dev to build all the chart stuff. And my teammate, the other developer, will also branch off of dev to do the profile stuff. Now, maybe their change was a lot more fast than mine, right? I'm building a whole chart. They're just updating the profile screen. So they would have their fixes and they would merge back into dev like you see here. And I'm still working on mine. But as you can see, dev has changed since I branched off of that. So what I can do is, my teammate will be like, hey, Sean, I finished my profile work. I merged it back into dev. If you want to pull down the latest dev into your branch, that way you can have all the changes. So what I can do is I can pull in the latest version of dev into my branch and keep working on my own branch, but that ensures that I have the latest version of dev. Now, the reason you want to do that is, as you can imagine, like let's pretend, my feature is huge. It's going to take me 2 months to build. So I'm on my own branch. Well, dev is constantly being worked on, so dev is going to change a lot before I'm ready to merge my changes back into dev. So that is why I want to constantly be pulling in the new dev into my branch to make sure I'm up to date and I'm not like breaking anything. Also, what can happen there is something called merge conflicts. You may be thinking this already. If you have multiple developers working on the same code base and then you try and merge it all together, like what if you were working on the same, screen in the same line of code? Like whose changes, get merged? Well, merge conflicts can be a headache, and they do happen with teams. Good communication on like what section of the app you're working on is a good way to avoid it, but that can happen. So again, that's another benefit of consistently bringing in the dev branch into my branch. So if there are merge conflicts, they're likely to be small and easily fixable. Whereas if I just worked by myself for this long time on the dev branch, and then 2 months later tried to merge my branch back into dev is going to have changed so much. Very likely there's going to be a lot of merge conflicts and it's going to be a headache to untangle. All right, I worry going on that merge conflict tangent might have been overwhelming. Don't worry about merge conflicts right now as a beginner. You're going to deal with that way later in your journey. But again, just know that they exist. And back to how these branches work. Eventually, I'll merge my changes into dev. The other developers will merge their changes into dev. The team will say, okay, great, version 6 is ready. And then we merge dev as a whole back into master for version 6 to push to the App Store. So that's how a team of developers from all around the world can work on the same code base, right? Because the code base lives on GitHub on the remote server. So like I said, my teammate could be like, hey, Sean, I push my changes up to the dev branch. He pushes them up to remote, and I could be living across the world, and I can pull down his changes into my computer to work on the latest version of the app. Now, again, these were all pretty simplified examples. Like I said, a team of 20 to 50. You can imagine how this can get pretty complex. But again, at least you know this exists now. If you are confused, that's perfectly fine. This is a confusing topic. Comment section as always, and then feel free to hit up the Slack channel to ask questions about it. Everybody in there is more than helpful. See you in the next video. Let's talk about third-party libraries, or you may hear them called dependencies or just libraries. It's all the same thing. What these are is basically a module of code that other developers have written that you can bring in and use into your code base. Let me give you an example. Here in the Aluna app, we track the user's measurements via a chart that you can see here. Now, creating a whole line chart that can be flexible and dynamic and take in different date ranges, that's a lot of work. So in this case, we brought in the third-party library called Charts to help us make this chart. Now, of course, you can customize it. As you can see, the colors match the app, but the core foundation of building the chart was completed by the library. These libraries are often hosted on GitHub, so you can go check them out. So for example, here is the Charts library. It'll show you how to use it, it'll have the documentation, and even some pictures, hopefully if it's a good one, of what it does. So as you can see, there's various different types of charts in this library. And just to give you a couple more examples of what you can do with libraries, here's a progress HUD. Here we have some different transitions you can do via view controllers. And then there's other libraries that can help you out with like your networking code, to talk to the server and the client. And there are a ton of libraries out there that you can use, but that's where you got to be careful. But we'll get back to that later in the video. Let's talk about how you go about using these libraries, because you may have heard these words before, right? You may have heard CocoaPods, Carthage, Swift Package Manager. Those are what you would use to install these libraries. Now let me give you the lay of the land real quick, because this area is changing as we speak, right? CocoaPods is the incumbent. They've been around for years. This was the main way people installed their libraries in iOS development. And then Carthage came along a few years ago and was kind of a competitor to CocoaPods. However, Swift Package Manager, that is Apple's first-party dependency manager. And that just came out, I believe, a year or two ago. So that is still pretty new. But even though it's new, it's rapidly gaining popularity amongst developers. And in my opinion, in another year or two, Swift Package Manager is going to be like the default way all developers do it. We're kind of in a transitionary period. So the advice to you just learning is when you do decide to tackle these third-party libraries, again, I don't recommend it for beginners. Don't worry if you don't fully understand all this now. This is more for later in your journey. But just remember, when it comes time to third-party libraries, you're going to see a lot of information about CocoaPods out there because, again, they were the incumbent for so long. But Swift Package Manager is what I would be learning if I was just starting today. Now, let's talk about those downsides, because I know you may be thinking, wow, if there's a library for just about everything, man, I can just find a library, put it together like a puzzle, and there's my app. And I get your logic. I understand that. And that's how a lot of web development is. But I wouldn't do that in iOS development. The general rule of thumb is that using libraries is okay, but use them sparingly. And here's why, right? They're called dependencies for a reason. You're depending on other people's code. And as you may know, or may not know, Swift is a rapidly evolving language because it's only 5 years old. It's still kind of growing. And also the iOS platform constantly changes, right? iOS 13, iOS 14, the new phones with the notch. So the platform and the language are constantly evolving, which is fine. That's actually what I like about it. But if you find yourself using 20 libraries, now you're counting on those 20 developers to keep their library up to date. And trust me, it is very, very common for libraries to get abandoned and no longer maintained. Like you'll go to it and it'll say the last update was 2 years ago. Well, that's pretty much a dead library. So not only do you have to use them sparingly, you got to be careful in which ones you used to make sure that they're actively maintained. Now, the good news is the most popular ones, like this chart ones, as you can see here, you always want to look for the stars on the GitHub repo. That's a good indication of how popular it is, which is a direct proxy to how much it's used. So the more it's used, the more it's apt to be, actively maintained. Because again, if you're relying on a library for a key piece of functionality in your app, and then all of a sudden that library stops being maintained, now you're stuck with this old code, and as Swift updates, as iOS updates, now you have to maintain it yourself or find a different one. And again, that's just one example. Imagine if you're using 20 or 30 libraries, now you're probably gonna have 4 or 5 that are dealing with that, and you're just gonna have a headache in your code base all the time. So again, the rule of thumb, use them sparingly, make sure they're well maintained, you'll thank yourself later. Another downside to using them is you get a lot of bloat. Like, let's go back to this charts repo real quick. You see all these different charts you can do? Like, that's pretty cool. That's a pretty nice feature of the library. However, most likely if you bring in this library, like we do at Luna, we just wanted the line chart. Well, when you bring in that library, you're bringing in all the code for all those other charts and all the functionality behind those charts. So typically bringing in these third-party dependencies, you're bringing in a lot of bloat, meaning a lot of extra code that you don't need. For example, in the Luna code base, I believe you can run a command to see the lines of code in your project. In the Luna code base, when I did this, was like 6,000-7,000 lines of code without libraries. When I added the libraries, which there was about 5 or 6 of them, it went up to like 60,000 lines. So you can see a 10x in bloat from bringing in the libraries. So just keep that in mind as well. You're really ballooning the size of your app by bringing those in, which again may not be a bad thing. It may be a necessity, but again, just something to keep in mind. And the last bit I want to talk about is when you're deciding like when you should use a library, because oftentimes, new inexperienced developers will say, why would I reinvent the wheel? Like, somebody's already written this code. Let me just use that. It'll save me 2 weeks worth of work. And I get that thinking, but if you're building a product or you're building a startup or a business around your app and you plan on this app being around for 2, 3, 4, 5 more years, that 2 weeks or a month you took up front will be nothing in the grand scheme of things, and you'll be so much better off that you wrote it yourself and you have control of that code. You're not depending on some library to do it. So again, these are just some things you should be thinking about when it comes time to use a library. Again, use them sparingly. If you overdo it, you're gonna have headaches, trust me. And then also the ones you do choose to use, make sure they're actively maintained and they're going to be around for the next year or two. So that's the overview on libraries. Of course, as always, if you have questions about this, read the comment section or, post a comment down below. And as always, we have the Slack channel. See you in the next video. When we're building or designing our apps, oftentimes we start with what's called the happy path or the golden path. Right? This is how we're designing our app. This is how we want users to use our app. This is how users are supposed to use our app, right? However, once your apps are out in the wild, out in the real world, it doesn't always work like that. And you have to handle what are called edge cases, right? These are kind of not the normal way to use your app, but you still have to handle it. Like, let's walk through some examples. How does your app work when there's a very, very bad internet connection or no internet connection at all? Like, can you handle that? Or what if you're in a really crucial function in your app and the user just kills your app, right? Just, swipes up on the screen, kills the app. How does your app handle that? Or what if you're expecting an email in the field, right? You want to collect the user's email and the user just types 13 emojis. Can you handle that? Or what if, your app requires location permissions and the user actually gave you those location permissions. However, 3 weeks later, they revoked those permissions. Is your app able to handle that change in permissions? Or will it just crash and break everywhere because you just assume that once you got permission, you would always have permission? And you could go on and on and on thinking of all the crazy edge cases and handling them. But again, back to that building that happy path or the golden path of how your users are supposed to use your app, that is like half the battle, right? Once you get that happy path done, now you got to handle the edge cases, right? Because again, if you've ever built an app and handed it to a user and watched them use it, there's a very good chance that they are not going to use it anywhere near the way you want them to use it, or like I said, how they're supposed to use it. Let's finish off the examples with one more that's actually very common, and that is handling empty arrays, right? So for example, let's say we're showing a list of followers on the screen that we got. Well, the happy path is to always expect, hey, there's going to be followers. Well, what if that array is empty? What if the user has no followers? Are you just showing a blank screen? Well, you shouldn't. You should show an empty state saying, hey, this user has no followers, right? So even though an edge case may not crash your app, it may lead to a poor user experience, right? Have you ever used an app, just came to a blank screen, or the app just froze and did nothing at all without telling you anything, right? Like, this bad user experience. So oftentimes handling all these edge cases is more about creating a smooth user experience as the user uses your app, quote unquote, improperly, right? We call it fail gracefully, right? It's impossible to build an app that doesn't fail or doesn't have a situation where it can break. The key here is to fail gracefully in that, like, okay, something bad happened. Now let's handle it right. Give the user an informative error message so they know what's going on and move on, right? That's called failing gracefully. Now, as I mentioned a little earlier, like you can get real crazy thinking of edge cases, but this is where your triage skills come into play, right? You don't have to fix every single edge case, right? Because if there's an edge case that's so crazy and wild that it only affects, 0.1% of your users, like maybe you can spend your resources and your development time on other things rather than fixing all those super crazy 0.1% edge cases, right? Now, if something affects 2 to 5% of your users, of course you want to fix that like right away. And also your size matters, right? So I just said 0.1% of your users. Well, if you have 10, 100,000 users, sure, that's not a large number. If you're Facebook, 0.1% of your users is a very large number. So again, the larger your user base, the more you have to fix those crazy corner cases, because again, that's a lot of people out there. But like I said, what edge cases you actually go fix is a decision you have to make, one, based on your resources, like how much development time do you have, how many users is it affecting, like what percentage. So all that comes into play when choosing which ones to fix and which ones to just live with, right? And that's what's called triage. So thinking of these edge cases not only makes a great product, but it's going to help you in job interviews as well. Often for a job interview, you'll get a take-home project to do, or maybe you're live coding on a whiteboard, or you're on a phone screen where you have to do an hour coding on a computer. You should absolutely be thinking and telling your interviewer, like, okay, this is a potential edge case, or this is how I would handle the array being empty. Thinking of those edge cases is absolutely vital in those interviews because, again, it shows that you're an experienced developer who will think of those things. Oftentimes, it's the very beginner developer that doesn't think of the crazy edge cases, and they only handle the happy path. And then when a user veers off that happy path, things go crazy. So again, the edge cases can help you make a great product as well as help you in interviews. There's a high-level overview of edge cases. I think this could be fun. Feel free to leave some crazy edge cases you've come across in the comments or in the Slack channel. I think it would be kind of fun to just share some weird ways users used your app that led to a crazy edge case that you had to fix. And I think the community at large can benefit from that knowledge as well. Being a software developer, not just an iOS engineer, but just any general software developer, is probably one of the most flexible careers like a person can have. And that's why I love it. You have so many options. And that's what we're going to talk about in this video, right? You can go the big company route. You can go the small startup route. You can go independent contractor or freelancer, where you're like a digital nomad. You can work from anywhere. You can build your own products, build your own companies. Like the options are almost endless. So let's talk about those main ones. First up, let's talk about the path of going to a big company, like an Apple, Google. Let's get the obvious stuff out of the way first, right? Like the pay is going to be very good. You're going to have awesome health benefits. You're going to work on a great team. You're going to have the prestige of that name on your resume, which is going to help you, the rest of your career. So a lot of good stuff in going to a big company. There are some downsides. Oftentimes, not every time, but often you will end up specializing in one area. Like the kind of the joke, the exaggeration is like, oh, you'll be the login screen person and that's it. And again, that's not always the case, but you tend to have narrow responsibilities at a big company, right? You specialize. Whereas at a startup, you have to wear a lot of different hats, right? Even though you're a developer, you may be getting into marketing or product and all this stuff, right? You have to do a lot more because there's only, a small number of you. So now let's talk about those small startups, right? They tend to have benefits as well. Now, if it's a super small startup, you may not have benefits, but I would say anything 5 employees and above, you're probably going to have benefits. But the pay is probably average. Oftentimes startups can't compete with those big Google, Apple pay, but the trade-off you get at a startup is you often get equity in the company, right? You get some shares. If the company were ever to get acquired or go public, those shares would theoretically be worth a lot of money if you got in early enough. Now, here's the thing. They call it an exit. For every good exit, again, that's when a company gets acquired or goes public, for every good exit, there's 100 where those startups fail or go out of business, or those shares end up being worthless. So even though getting equity in a company is cool, I consider them to be almost like lottery tickets, right? I don't value them too much because the odds of them hitting are pretty slim. And not only are the odds of them hitting pretty slim, but you also have to be at that company for like 4 or 5 years, which again, nowadays, many people don't stay at a company for that long. So a lot of dominoes have to fall into place for that to work out for you. But I actually prefer small startups to big companies. It's my personal preference, right? Because I like the tight-knit team. Again, I've worked at companies, of 5 people to 25 people and everywhere in that range. And that's just pretty cool, right? It's a tight-knit team. And I like wearing many hats, right? I don't think I would enjoy being a specialist and only programming and working on this one thing. Like, I enjoy being part of the marketing discussions at the startup. I enjoy having input on the product. I enjoy, helping hire a marketing director, right? Like, I like having my hands in things. I don't know. I just find it interesting. That's a personal preference. You may like specializing, but I just want to tell you the difference between going to a big company and a startup. Now let's talk about freelancing, sometimes also called independent contracting. But the idea here is that you're working on a contract basis on, a couple different apps. Maybe you have one contract that's a big one. Maybe you have a couple small ones. But the benefits here is just flexibility and freedom. You get to you work remotely, right? You heard the concept of a digital nomad where people just travel the world working remotely on contracts out of coffee shops. Like, that sounds like a pretty fun life. Or you can just work from home. That works too. But the reason people like this is because there's no commute. They make their own schedule. You have a lot of freedom. But with a lot of freedom comes some downside and responsibility. So contracting is great, but the hardest part about it is getting a consistent stream of contracts, right? Because if your contracts are up, you're not getting paid. You go on vacation, you're not getting paid. It's just a different lifestyle. For example, when I was contracting earlier in my career, I had another contract lined up, but it wasn't starting for 4 weeks. So I couldn't really line anything up to fit in that 4 weeks. So I just went without getting paid for 4 weeks. And that's not uncommon for contractors. So if you like that freelancing lifestyle, if that sounds awesome, traveling the world, I know it does, but it's hard. Not gonna lie, it's hard. And my recommendation, because they call it feast or famine, you'll have some periods of time where you're making so much money, and then you'll have other periods of times where you can't find a contract and you're making no money. So the recommendation is, if you want to try that freelancing, I would recommend working at a company first, knowing you have a plan to freelance, and start building up some savings, right? Because you need an emergency fund if you're going to be a contractor. And then also, while you're working full time, you can maybe start lining up contracts on the side, maybe start building connections, because in contracting, your network is extremely valuable. That's how I get all my contracts, right? My personal and professional network, word of mouth, the YouTube channel helps, but it's never going to Upwork or some internet site and finding contracts. So again, if you're thinking about freelancing, work at a company, start building up your network, maybe find a small contract or two, build up a nest egg of money, and then make the leap. Trust me, you'll thank me for that advice later. Now let's talking about building your own thing, because this is kind of the most vague, the most flexible, but it's great if you're entrepreneurial and you want to, create your own startup. One of the biggest problems startups have is finding technical people, finding developers that are good. So if you can just eliminate that problem by you being the developer, you have so much freedom. And again, if you have an idea, build it. It's almost like a superpower being a developer, right? And you don't even have to go as far as building your own startups. Maybe you can just build your own portfolio of independent apps. And then over time, those 10 apps are making enough money for your living, right? It's just, again, this career path is so flexible. Big company, startup, freelancing, building your own thing. I just love it. I'm so happy you're on this path, and I hope that I can help you get your start, because it's a wonderful life, not gonna lie. In this section, we're going to talk about the world of iOS development, some of the resources that I use to this day to continue my learning, and then some of the resources I used back when I first got my start. Now, I know this section isn't teaching you how to code directly, but in my opinion, it is still insanely valuable. Because again, the whole point of this course was to set you up for success, right? I want you to use this foundation to continue your journey, continue building upon it towards a successful career. You've probably heard the phrase, give somebody a fish and they eat for a day. Teach somebody how to fish and they eat for a lifetime. Well, I'm trying to teach you how to fish, and that's what this section does. We'll cover a bunch of different blogs and websites that I visit on a regular basis to keep my knowledge up to date. I'll show you how to use Twitter most effectively. Yeah, I said Twitter. Believe it or not, as a developer, Twitter might be the most valuable tool you have when it comes to learning and networking, getting jobs, getting that interview. Twitter is insanely powerful, and I know it kind of gets a bad rap, all the political and bullying stuff, but developer Twitter is amazing. And we'll also cover a bunch of recommended books, recommended podcasts you should be listening to, because I believe in complete immersion when you're learning this stuff. And the more you immerse yourself in this world, the better you're going to learn it and the faster you're going to learn it. And then we'll also talk about WWDC and what that is. If you're not familiar, that's the Worldwide Developers Conference that Apple puts on every year in June. And we'll talk about why it's the best time of year for iOS developers. It's like Christmas, and if you don't celebrate Christmas, whatever happy time of the year you celebrate, it's better than that for iOS developers, and we'll talk about all that. So onward with this valuable section, and I hope by the end of it, you at least know how to fish a little bit. Let's talk about my favorite time of year. Like, I literally take the week off of work for it, and that is WWDC, which stands for Worldwide Developers Conference. And what that is Apple's big conference that they put on every year, usually the first week of June, where they announce all the new stuff, the new toys for developers, right? This is where you get your first sneak peek at the new iOS, right? Like coming up in 2020, it'll be iOS 14, all the new stuff in macOS, etc. As developers, you'll be able to download the beta to put it on your phone to play with all the new stuff. You'll see all the new frameworks coming out. Like, for example, Swift itself was announced, a surprise announcement, at WWDC back in 2014. SwiftUI, surprise announcement, 2019 WWDC. So this is when all the big stuff happens. It's the best time of year for iOS developers. Now, the great thing is you can experience this in two ways. One, if you're lucky enough to go, which is like $1,600, at least as of 2019, for a ticket, and you have to win a lottery to even go. It's a super expensive trip. But if you live in the area or you can make it, and you have the money, I would recommend going, as it is a great time, right? iOS developers from all over the world converge onto San Jose, California. And it's also a great place to meet developers you may have been networking with on Twitter or content creators you like another weird flex, I know, but I took probably 100 plus selfies at WWDC 2019. It's just a cool place to go actually meet people that you've interacted on Twitter with all year, right? Because everybody just, descends on this area. But of course, going to California, getting that $1,600 ticket, that is expensive. Totally get it. The bright side is that Apple live streams every single session. And a session is when they're introducing a new topic. For example, when they introduced Swift, that was a session. And they always do a what's new in Swift, where they talk about the new stuff coming out. There's over 100 sessions, usually about a half hour to an hour long, and they're all available through the Apple Developer app that you can watch on your Apple TV, on your phone, on your iPad. So literally the whole month of June, I'm just watching WWDC sessions, not watching any TV, just catching up on dub. So like I said, even if you can't make it in person, you can still experience it, because also aside from watching all the sessions, Twitter is just a buzz. iOS dev Twitter is a party during that time. Everybody's tweeting out stuff. They're playing with the new frameworks, playing with the new toys, tweeting out their opinion on the new features. It's just an awesome time of year as an iOS developer. And it's funny, every year I try to say, I'm going to watch every session because I get so pumped. I usually end up watching about 30 to 40 of the sessions, but it's literally like whatever your favorite TV show ever is, it'd be like if they just dropped 4 seasons on Netflix and you just get to binge it, right? That's pretty much what it's like. Now let's talk about the betas. I know I touched on it a little bit before, but there's betas for iPadOS, iOS, macOS, watchOS. Basically every platform Apple has, they release the betas. And it's not wise to go download the betas on what we call your daily driver. That means the phone you use every day, the one you need, because betas are buggy, betas will crash all the time, especially a macOS beta. Maybe some programs you need won't work on the new beta. So don't download the beta unless you have a spare device that you can put it on to test things out. But the whole purpose of these betas, even though I think most people use it just to play around with the new toys before the general public gets to, is that it's to help developers get their apps ready for the new iOS release. For example, this September 2020, iOS 14 will be released. We don't know anything about it yet, but if there's big features, developers have to get their apps ready, so when it's officially launched in September, their apps are ready to go. So what happens is developers update their apps from June to September on the betas. They get all the new features ready. That way, again, when the new iPhone event that happens in late September and iOS 14 launches, their app is all updated, ready to go on day one. Now, this course is coming out in March of 2020. So if you're watching this right away, WWDC 2020 comes in June, so it's right around the corner. So let's talk about how you can learn as a brand new iOS developer. Now here's the thing, not gonna lie, it is going to be overwhelming for a new iOS developer. Like, I remember my first WWDC, which was 2015. I was excited. I got caught up in it. But when watching the sessions and, trying to follow on Twitter, reading the blog posts, hearing people's opinions, I had no idea what they were talking about. Like, I maybe understood 5 to 10% of it, the other 90% right over my head. That's fine. Like, I still am glad that I did that because that exposed me to everything. I was able to immerse myself. Even if I didn't get it, I was still hearing the terms. I was still, learning about, things that existed. Even if I didn't understand how it worked, I still knew it existed. And over time, as you're hearing this stuff, it starts to like sink in over time. But again, you got to immerse yourself. So even if you feel intimidated your very first year of WWDC, I would still watch it, still go through it. And again, I didn't understand almost any of it. But the good thing is that gets better. Like my next WWDC, I understood maybe 30 to 40% of it. And then by the third year, I was like all in. I obviously don't understand everything because they're talking about, frameworks and APIs that you never use. But like I understood the lingo. When they put code up on the screen, I knew exactly what was going on. It gets better and easier. And then again, by your second or third year, like Dub is going to be your favorite time of year. It's going to be awesome. It's just, you can tell I'm excited just talking about it. So in this video, I just wanted to let you know what WWDC was, why it's so exciting, how you can learn from it. And like I said, the keynote is kind of like the highlight of the event. That's what kicks everything off. It's like a 2-hour long keynote and they're showing off all the big picture features. Like, to be honest with you, like the keynote can be watched by like non-developers because it's really like, here's the new features in iOS 14. However, every other video is basically for developers. But yeah, just like try following along Twitter during the keynote. It's going too fast to even keep up with, but it's so much fun. So if WWDC 2020 is going to be your first one, we're going to be in Slack. We have a Slack group for this course. I'm sure everybody in Slack is going to be talking about it. It's just a fun community event. Again, it's the best time of year. So I hope you enjoy your first WWDC. If Twitter isn't the most valuable thing in my developer career, it's definitely in the top 3. And that surprises so many new developers. And I know Twitter gets a bad rap, all the politics, bullying, cancel culture. Like, I get it, Twitter can be bad. But the thing about Twitter is you kind of control what you see, right? Like, based on who you follow, like, that's what you're going to see. So if you focus a Twitter account, and I've even seen people do this, right? They have their personal Twitter account for all their hobbies or whatever they're into, and then they create a special developer account, and that's like their professional account where all they do is follow developers. That's how they interact with the developer community, etc. So like I said, I kind of get why you may have reservations about joining Twitter, but I'm here to tell you in this video, it's insanely, insanely valuable for developers. And that's because developers pretty much live on Twitter, like almost too much. But the point is like that's where everybody hangs out in the developer community. Now, the first benefit of Twitter I want to talk about is networking. It is probably the #1 way to network in a developer community, right? Of course, you can go to conferences, go to local meetups, but that's a small number of people, whereas Twitter is like the whole industry. Let me share a quick story about something that can only happen on Twitter, right? I have another course out called the iOS Take-Home Project course where we implement a collection view and we use this new thing in iOS 13 called diffable data source. Well, I'm talking about it on Twitter. I'm sharing my work. I'm retweeting other students, tweeting stuff out. And an engineer named Steve Breen, liked the tweet, retweeted the tweet, started following me. And if you look into who Steve Breen is, he's an Apple engineer working on the UI collection view team who actually helped build the diffable data source stuff. And actually, if you watch the WWDC video on diffable data source, he's the one up there presenting, introducing this to the world. So now Steve knows about my work. We follow each other on Twitter. We can now interact. And that kind of stuff can only happen on Twitter. So back to networking, right? Again, Twitter is like the #1 way to network as a developer. Now, when you're networking, keep in mind that networking is a long-term investment, right? This is going to be something that pays off and you build over years. But that's okay. You plan on being an iOS developer for years, right? And because you're building that over your entire career, yes, you may want to try to network with those Apple engineers or those more senior engineers, but don't forget to network with your peers right now, other developers just learning like you. Again, another story. I did my iOS Developer Bootcamp in 2015, so that's 5 years ago now, And my peers there were just a bunch of students who didn't even really know how to program. Now, 2 of those graduates are engineers at Apple. Another went on to work at Coinbase and built the native Coinbase app during the 2017, crypto boom. It's just, my point is your peers right now in 3 to 5 years are going to go on to do great things. So if you're building those relationships now and let those build over 5 years, when it comes time to get probably not that first job, right? Because they may not be able to help you right away. But, 3, 4, 5 years into your career, when you're ready to go work at a big company, Facebook, Instagram, Apple, Google, YouTube, whatever, now it's very likely that you're going to have contacts and relationships with people on those teams. Now you may be wondering well, how do I network on Twitter? We're going to get into finding people to follow later in the video, but at the end of the day, Twitter is just a conversation, right? So if you follow people and you see them talking about something, join the conversation. Don't just pop in with a thumbs up emoji, but actually have something intelligent to say. Or another way is to interact with content creators' content. And that kind of leads me to another reason why Twitter is so valuable. If you follow all the YouTubers, the bloggers, the podcasters, right? They're constantly putting out awesome Swift iOS developer learning material. And how do they share that material? They put it out on Twitter. So if you're following all those people, your feed is going to be a constant influx of new blog posts to read, new podcasts to listen to, new YouTube videos to watch. You're going to constantly get knowledge presented right in front of you. So it's a great way to learn as well. And that content presents 2 opportunities for you to network. One is with the content creator itself. Content creators in this space typically have the big ones, 20 to 30,000 Twitter followers. It may sound like a lot, but as somebody with almost 20,000 myself, weird flex, I know. You're going to get noticed, right? If you retweet my stuff and retweet with a comment, or you're always liking, you're always commenting on my tweets, I'm not big enough to not notice you, right? So nobody in the iOS space is too big to not notice you. So interact with the content, actually read someone's blog post after they tweet it and say, hey, thanks for the blog post. I really liked what you said about this. It really helped a lot. Thanks. That means a ton for the content creators. And if you're constantly supporting them, constantly retweeting their stuff, constantly commenting, they're going to know who you are. And again, that's just networking. It's a 2-way street, right? The content creator gave you valuable content, helped you learn. You help them out by sharing their stuff and interacting and engaging with their content. That's how networking works. It's a 2-way street. Now you may be thinking, well, what good does a retweet do if I have 7 followers, right? I get that. That's the power of hashtags come in. So still retweet it, maybe retweet it with a comment on it, and then make sure you use hashtag iOSDev or hashtag SwiftLang. Those are the hashtags that people search in this community. So even if you have no followers, when you put the hashtags on there, that content can still get discovered and you're helping the content creator share. And again, this is not about, hey, you should help content creators. Again, this is about networking to the point where you can build a relationship with that content creator. Because I can tell you firsthand, I know developers and have built relationships with developers because they've been sharing my stuff for years now. And I'll tell you what, if they ever asked me for a favor or needed help for something or needed a recommendation for a job, I would go way above and beyond for them because they have been supporting my work for years. Again, it's a 2-way street. So back to the benefits of networking. Remember, I want to stress this. This is a long-term investment, right? You can't just reply to a couple tweets and then in a month later be like, networking doesn't work, right? I didn't get a job from it. That's not how it goes. This is going to pay off 1, 2, 3, 4 years down the road. Again, if you've done networking correctly after 3, 4 years, you're going to have contacts at basically every major tech company out there. That's how I used it, right? I built up my network and my contacts mostly through my YouTube channel. But when it came time for me to start interviewing at big companies, I didn't go to the website and apply, right? I didn't go to lyft.com/jobs and fill out an application. I went to Twitter, went to my contacts, said, hey, so-and-so, I'm interested in interviewing at Lyft. I'm just using Lyft as an example. Would you mind passing on my resume? After you've built that relationship over a couple years, they're going to be more than happy to do it. And you're doing it that way, pretty much get you a guaranteed interview. Now, of course, once you're in the interview, it's up to you to perform. But that's how, once you've built a network, you can pretty much get an interview at any company, as long as they have an opening. So that's where the value comes in. And again, that doesn't pay off till 1, 2, 3, 4 years down the road. So let's talk about some ways not to network, right? So definitely get in there and ask questions. Feel free to tag one person and ask questions, but you need to be courteous of that person's time. And I'm speaking firsthand, right? I get this all the time. A lot of times people will tag me and then they'll just copy and paste a huge view controller. Hey, Sean, can you fix my bug? Like that's not how you do it. But if you ask me a question on Twitter and you tag me and it's something I can answer off the top of my head in like 5 minutes, I'm happy to give you a valuable, insightful response. Career related questions, maybe how to solve a simple problem if you're stuck. Like that's how you do it. Again, so when you're asking a question on Twitter, be respectful of their time and think, okay, how long is it going to take them to answer this? And if it's short, go for it. If you got to copy and paste code and they got to read it and try to fix your bug, like that's not how you do it. Another thing you don't do is don't ask your question and tag 10 people, right? I see that all the time. Somebody will have a question and they'll tag all the top content creators in the iOS space. All that does is that just spams that person's mentions as people are replying to that, right? So that's just not a good look. That's more you're annoying who you're trying to get help from, and that's never a good thing. Now let's talk about like who to follow. Well, first of all, down in the description of this video, I'm going to list a handful of must follow Twitter accounts in the iOS dev space, but you're going to need to follow more than that. And there's two main ways to do that. One is to see who those people are following. For example, if you go to my account, you can see who I'm following. Go down that list and follow the developers you find interesting. Now you're gonna have to sift through some like sports stuff, some comedy stuff, some crypto stuff, but it is mostly developers. And then follow the ones you like and then repeat that with other developers. See who they're following so you can quickly build up your list. Now here's the trick though. When you quickly build up your list like this, not all developers like to tweet about developer stuff, right? Sometimes you may follow a developer and you may find 90% of the stuff they tweet is stuff you don't care about and 10% is developer stuff. Well, you don't have to keep following them. So I guess what I'm trying to say is this is probably going to be a process. You'll end up following a bunch of developers and then you may end up having to unfollow stuff to like just prune your list so you get the good content that you want. Another great way to find followers is to follow events. For example, WWDC 2020 is coming up in June, if the coronavirus doesn't cancel it, but that'll be an event that all iOS developers are following. They're going to be a hashtag WWDC20. And if you follow that hashtag, you'll see all kinds of developers tweeting and commenting about what's going on in WWDC. That is another great way to find developers in the space. So that's some ways to find people to follow. And again, I'm going to have a list to get you started in the description. But again, I can't stress enough, Twitter is probably the most valuable tool. It's a great way to build relationships with other developers. You can find help on your questions. You can potentially get jobs because you're going to know a lot of people at all the big tech companies. It's so valuable. And you're going to learn a lot. Again, all the content creators, sharing and pushing the content that they're, putting out there, the iOS dev knowledge. So it is insanely valuable. I understand you may have reservations about joining Twitter because it does get a bad rap, but if you use it correctly, because again, you control who you follow, you control what's on your feed. And if you follow somebody that's constantly retweeting political stuff you don't like or bullying stuff you don't like just unfollow them or block them, whatever. Like you control what you see. So if you stick to just the developer stuff, Twitter is amazing. I can't recommend it enough. And hopefully this video helped you out. The first website I want to share is Swift by Sandel by John Sandel. Now, John is a very prominent name in the iOS Swift space, so his articles are always high quality. Now, admittedly, some of his articles, and he does them weekly, by the way, usually on Sunday, but some of them may be a little too advanced for the absolute beginner or somebody just beginning their journey. Those are his regular articles that come out on Sunday. However, I still wanted to share this because one, you're going to grow to look forward to these articles as you gain more experience, but he also has a basics section, as you see here, where he has, again, great high quality articles on some of the basic Swift and iOS developer concepts, optionals, access control, enums, closures. That's always a tricky one, right? Introduction to SwiftUI, strings, generics. So definitely check out his basics articles, and then as you gain more experience, you'll start to appreciate the weekly articles more. John also has a great podcast, probably one of the best in the space. We'll get to that in the podcast video though. Next up, we have Hacking with Swift by Paul Hudson. If you're not familiar with Paul, @2straws on Twitter, follow him. He is a content creation machine. He's got books, podcasts, articles, videos, definitely a vital resource for the Swift community. And the great thing about Paul is that he prides himself on keeping everything absolutely up to date, right? Like as soon as Swift 5.1 came out, all his articles were updated for Swift 5.1. So if you're Googling and you come across a Hacking with Swift, solution to your problem, you can bet your bottom dollar that it is going to be the latest and greatest. It's not going to be out of date, which can be a problem if you find something on Stack Overflow. Now, I could spend probably a half hour reviewing all the stuff he has on this website, but I'll leave that for you to explore. I'll share some highlights that I think are valuable for the beginners out there. And let's go to Learn tab up here at the top. And he has these two concepts, 100 days of Swift. So this is one Swift lesson a day for 100 days for you to continue practicing your Swift. And he goes through the rules of the course. You can see the whole curriculum here. Again, I don't want to spend too much time on it, but he also has 100 days of SwiftUI. So if you want to dive into the SwiftUI, same concept, one SwiftUI lesson per day for 100 days. And there's a whole hashtag around it so you can follow along other people doing it as well. So if you're interested in that sort of like learning progression and practice, highly recommend this. Now, admittedly, I rarely just come to the site and surf around. I usually get to the site via a Twitter post, or most likely, and how I find the site most valuable is a Google search. So take a common thing, right? How to shuffle an array in Swift. How to shuffle an array Swift, right? And you search for it. You're going to get, some Stack Overflow questions, but I always look for the Hacking with Swift article. You can see I've already kind of clicked on this one. And because you're going to get, this is up to date. Like I said, a Stack Overflow article, maybe back in Swift 3, it may be out of date, but you're going to get an up-to-date answer. And it's always so concise. And this conciseness is amazing for somebody who has a couple years of experience in iOS development. You can just get right to the point. However, if you're just a beginner, maybe you might want to look for something that gives more of an explanation. Don't get me wrong, this .shuffle and .shuffled, very straightforward, but some of the more complex things, he's still concise, which again, I love and appreciate. But if you're just beginning, I think you'll find yourself just copying and pasting to get it working. And Paul does offer, you can see all the books here on the right. He offers the content to teach you that deep learning, but just be careful of just copy, paste, it works. Okay, you always want to know what your code is doing. All right, let's move on to raywunderlich.com, another insanely valuable site for the iOS developer community. In fact, this is how I learned, right? Back in 2015, I pretty much lived on this site. So I can kind of personally vouch for this. This is how I learned. Of course, the site has changed a lot in the past 5 years, but I definitely enjoyed my learning on this site. Now, this site is all about videos. It is a subscription. It does cost. Let's go to the store, right? I don't want to find your subscription plan here. So it's either $19 a month or $14.99 if you buy it annually. So $15 to $20 a month to invest in your iOS learning. But again, if we go back, the amount of videos they have is just insane on all these iOS topics, right? Beginning ARKit, data structures and algorithms in Swift, SwiftUI, what's new in Xcode 11, the workflow. And there's a whole getting started with iOS section. So they do have a beginner. And there's even, if you click on paths, right? We want to pick iOS and Swift for beginners, not Android and Kotlin. Come on. So start path. And you can see there's even a nice path of courses that they have for you to start your iOS developer journey, and continue this. Now, to be honest, most of this beginner stuff we've already covered in this course, but not all of it, right? You see collection views. We didn't do that. Animations. We didn't do all that. So this still can propel your learning. And like I said, that's just their beginner path. But even after you're not a beginner anymore and, you want to learn some advanced topics like machine learning for iOS, as you see here, push notifications, just an insane resource. Again, yes, it is $20 a month or $15 if you buy the annual, but in my opinion, that's a small investment into your learning to make this a career. And again, this is how I learned. I spent that $20 a month for about a year and just lived on this site. So I enjoyed it. Moving on, we have Swiftly by Antoine Vanderlee. He just posts a lot of basically all skill levels from beginner to advanced. So he's also a good follow on Twitter. Give him a follow. That's how I discover his articles. He puts it out on Twitter. I always check him out. You're definitely going to learn a lot with his articles. I could scroll here, but it's basically just a myriad of topics. Again, all the way from beginner to advanced, but definitely a must follow and definitely a must bookmark. Same thing with Donnie Walls here. Relative newcomer on the scene, if you will, probably for the past year he's been putting out content, but he's an iOS developer at Disney, and he, again, same thing, kind of similar to Antoine Vanderlee. Not that they put out the same content, but he posts a variety of beginner to advanced stuff. But if we go to the blog, you can see some of the topics. These are probably more advanced stuff than you're looking for. But back down here, you can see some relatively simple stuff, right? Like how to sort an array based on a property, how to add an element to the start of an array. So he does do some beginner stuff. But again, a lot of these resources that I'm showing you aren't necessarily just beginner resources, right? Like I said, this is the stuff that I use and learn to this day. So you may have to grow into these resources a little bit, but you're definitely going to want to follow them. Next up, let's talk about iOS Dev Weekly by Dave Verwer. So iOS Dev Weekly is a newsletter. However, you can come to the website here and see the newsletter. He shares a bunch of great links. It comes out every Friday. I recommend signing up for the newsletter so it gets delivered right to your email. This is the premier newsletter in iOS developer world. Like if you're an iOS developer, you got to subscribe to this newsletter. Like just enough said. And let's finish up with some SwiftUI focused stuff. Remember, like I said, the bulk of this course does focus on UI kit, but I still want to expose you to SwiftUI, even though it's still super early in SwiftUI. I can't emphasize that enough, but there are some blogs and websites that are popping up that are dedicated to SwiftUI. One, for example, here is the SwiftUI Lab. And let's go to articles here. And I like these articles because they're very visual. We'll scroll down to one that I checked out here a little bit ago just to make sure. So like advanced SwiftUI transitions, right? So this is the topic of SwiftUI transitions, but you can see his articles also have like animated GIFs to show you what you're building. So you can see this is transitioning, looks like a button here, all the different transitions. I'll let the screen play. You can see sliding to the right, fading in, fading out. So their articles are very visual, which is what I like about it. So definitely if you want to dive more into SwiftUI, bookmark the SwiftUI Lab. And then also you have Majid's blog here to finish up here. Much more simple looking, but this is also super dedicated to SwiftUI. For example, just the latest one on February 19th, mastering buttons in SwiftUI. Click on that. This is basically just how to use buttons in SwiftUI. And again, very visual, showing you what you're building. So big fan of that. That wraps up the blogs and websites that I visit on a regular basis to continue my learning and that I think you should bookmark. Of course, there are a ton more websites out there. I'm not saying this is like the only list. So if you have a website that you love, that you think is a valuable resource, definitely leave it in the comment section. I would love for the comments of this video to just be a great resource of links for other people to check out that are also learning as well. But again, bookmark these websites, check them on a regular basis, and we'll see you in the next video. In this video, I'm going to give you a bunch of book recommendations for you to continue on your learning. Two quick disclaimers. It's impossible for me to cover every possible book out there. So if you have a great book that you really like that I didn't list, please leave it in the comments. And again, if you're watching this video, make sure you check out the comments for further suggestions. And there will be links to all these in the description of the video, but I want to be completely transparent. A lot of them will be affiliate links. And that's just because I have relationships with everybody in the space. So I'm not trying to point you only to my affiliate links. That's not it at all. If you ask 10 developers, they're probably going to give you a list very similar to mine, but I do want to be upfront and honest about that. All right, on to my recommendations. First up is the site that I used the most to learn back in 2015 when I was getting started, and that is raywunderlich.com. Now we're going to scroll down. This is the video subscription service. You can do that if you like, but we're talking about books here, right? So I'm going to slowly scroll down. You can see iOS Apprentice teaches you everything just about iOS, essentially. You see machine learning, mastering Git. I'm not going to list all of them. The point is, as I scroll, I'll talk. You can see there are a ton of topics. So he's got 50 different books on everything. Animations, core data, push notifications, right? The list is so long. So Ray Wunderlich has a very vast library for pretty much any topic you may want to tackle in the iOS development space. And again, Ray Wunderlich is how I got my start, so I can kind of personally vouch for, the quality. And it is one of the biggest names in the space. So definitely check it out if you're interested. Next up, we have Hacking with Swift by Paul Hudson. You may start to see these names repeat a lot because, again, there's a lot of big names in the space that create a ton of content, but very similar to Ray Wunderlich, Paul has a book on almost every topic, right? Hacking with iOS, just the basics iOS, Swift in 60 seconds, Pro Swift, design patterns, testing, SwiftUI, right? Again, I'm not going to list everything, but you can scroll down and see all the books here. And I think really at the end of the day, right, there's a lot of great teachers out there, but what teaching style, what writing style resonates with you the most, that's whose books you should go to. So again, I know I'm kind of showing a lot of the same topics, but again, you're going to see different teaching styles and you may resonate more with different teaching styles. Next up, we have the Human Interface Guidelines. Now, this isn't like a Swift tutorial book like Ray Wunderlich or Hacking with Swift, but this is directly from Apple, basically telling you the best practices for their platforms. Like you have macOS, watchOS, tvOS. Let's click into iOS to show you some things here. So it's basically going to tell you how to properly design and use best practices in your app. So over here on the left, you can see we have app architecture, onboarding, how that should work. And it's going to tell you, again, the best practices. For example, this blue button here, it'll tell you every touch target should be at least 44 points tall, because again, that's the size of the average human fingertip, right? So it's stuff like that, right? A modality, right? It'll tell you how to properly create your modal sheets coming up. So I think this is just a must read for all iOS developers because it's going to tell you all the best practices on building iOS apps straight from Apple. And again, more things. Let's go to the user interaction section, right? Drag and drop. It'll tell you, again, the best practices on using drag and drop. It'll usually have videos to show you, how to do it. I mean, it's not going to show you a tutorial on how to do it, but it's going to show you the best practices on how to implement it on the iOS platform, right? That way your iOS app feels like an iOS app and not some just random concoction you came up with. And the reason that's important is because iOS users expect a certain, way of doing things. And if every single app on iOS had all kinds of different navigation, all different ways of doing things, like it would be a bad user experience, right? But when users use an iOS app, they kind of intuitively already know how to use it based on the best practices Apple has set forward. So if you want to learn more about those best practices, again, human interface guidelines, they update it constantly. For example, they just came out with a new update all about, Siri and how to implement that. So it's always updated. I always recommend iOS developers read through this at least once a year. Anyway, it's great stuff. It's a must read. Next up, we have a little bit of a shameless plug, and that is my own book called It's Only Crazy Until You Do It, How I Became an iOS Developer. And it tells my story because my story isn't the normal path, right? I went into the Navy right after high school. I was an insurance agent for 6 years. I went back to school at 30. I didn't really know what I wanted to do in my 20s. And then I wrote my first line of code at 32. And just kind of fell in love with development. And it tells the story, how that happened, how I learned to code, how I ended up getting my first job, and basically how I launched my career. And my goal for the book was for people exactly in your spot that are just learning to kind of be inspirational, right? Because, maybe some of you out there are a little older. Maybe you're not the 22-year-old kid, right? So hopefully it'll be inspirational to you to just tell you my story. And again, it's only like 60 pages, short little ebook that you can probably knock out in a couple days, but I've been told it's very inspirational, and that was my goal. Next up, if you want to dive into SwiftUI, we have some book by Mark Moykins, another YouTuber. He's created 2 SwiftUI books called SwiftUI Views Mastery and then SwiftUI Animations. Both of these, what I like about them is they're extremely visual. And I'm actually diving into SwiftUI myself, building a couple apps in it, really starting to learn it. And I've been using Mark's book myself. And like I said, they're page turners, I call it, because they're so visual. Like I always want to turn the page because I want to see what's on the next page. And it's not like a typical book, as you can see here, where you just have to read paragraphs and paragraphs. Like it's really, it's really short, quick, bite-sized stuff. And that's what I like about it. And then again, the visuals to actually show you what the code is doing, it's great stuff. So, of course, Ray Wunderlich, Hacking with Swift, they all had books as well, but I like Mark's because it's very, very visual. And then finally, we have the official Swift programming language book from Apple that's free to download. A lot of people will say start by reading this book. I actually disagree with that because I did that. I started. And as somebody who started with Swift, I had never coded before. This was all new. That book was just super overwhelming to me because it's very code heavy. You're just reading a lot of code. So while I do think this book is great once you have some knowledge behind you, I think it can be almost discouraging as the first thing you read to learn. So I definitely recommend reading this book, but I would come back to it once you've got a little bit of baseline knowledge under your belt. And even then, because this book gets into some of the advanced topics, the advanced topics may still be over your head, but this is also a book that you should probably read every year or two. Because again, this is constantly updated with every new version of Swift. So as new things come out, Swift changes. So that's my initial, kind of group of books. If you're interested in, taking this even further, like I said, it was impossible for me to hit every single book. I know there's going to be some great recommendations in the comments. So please, if I missed one, if you have one, leave it down there. And again, if you're watching, don't skip over the comments. Be sure to check those out. All right, see you in the next video. Now let's talk about iOS Developer Podcast. If you're already a podcast fan, you understand how valuable and useful they can be. If you haven't fallen in love with podcasts yet, or you don't really listen to them, I would actually recommend starting because they're just great on commutes or going for walks. It's great multitasking because you can be learning while you're driving to work or while you're walking the dog. It's great. So I'm to the point where I listen to music 15% of the time. The other 85% of the time I have my AirPods in, it's a podcast. I just love them so much. And part of learning iOS development, I believe in complete immersion. So if you're just learning, always throwing on an iOS developer podcast while you're driving to work or walking the dog, it's just going to help you out a lot. So let's start with some podcasts that you should be listening to. Let's just get this out of the way right away. The shameless plug, my own podcast called iOS Dev Discussions. I do a myriad of things. I think what most people like is I do a show called Origin Stories, where I have, developers, both well-known and not so well-known on the show. And we talk about how they got their start, how did they learn to code in the first place? Were they a child? Were they as an adult? Was it via school? what was it that made them want to learn to code, how they went about learning, how they got their very first iOS developer job. Again, it's their origin story, and a lot of people seem to like those. And branching off of origin stories, I created another show called The Journey, where I bring on people that are just learning. And the point of that show is to share other people's journey, what they're struggling with, how they're learning, what they're doing to become an iOS developer. And again, hopefully sharing that story, that information inspires others that are just learning as well. And then lastly, for my podcast, sometimes I'll pop on for like a quick 10 to 15 minute episode. I don't know, just talking about random topics that come to my head, of course, that have to do with iOS development and being a developer. Next up, we have Swift by Sandel, which is probably the most listened to podcast in the space. Like the numbers aren't public, but I would assume that. This comes out every 2 weeks, and he has a different guest on. Sometimes it's Apple employees, sometimes it's other well-known developers. What I like about this show is that he caters the topic of the episode to that guest. For example, when I was on the show, we talked about content creation, teaching, sharing your work, all that stuff, because that's, my strength. That's what I do. However, when he brings on somebody who is very focused in, let's say, machine learning, that episode is all about machine learning. So the topics are always different based on who the guest is. And that's why I like it. And it comes out, again, every 2 weeks. And like I said, it's probably the most popular podcast in the space. So definitely give it a listen. Next up, we have Swift Over Coffee with Paul Hudson and Erica Sadoun. And I don't think you can find two more knowledgeable people on Swift coming together to create a podcast. So again, another must listen. It comes out every 2 weeks as well. And they break the show down into, they do a news section, a pick section where both Paul and Erica will kind of pick something they want to talk about. And then they do an open ballot section where on Twitter, they'll put out open questions and you can actually interact with the show. It's kind of like the fan interaction, if you will, asking your Swift questions to, again, two of the most knowledgeable people in the space. Up next, we have Fireside Swift with Steve Berard and Zach Falgo. This is a unique podcast because it's very casual and laid back. Don't get me wrong, you're still talking about hardcore Swift and iOS developer concepts, but if you just want like a laid back, funny conversation where they're cracking jokes, having a good time, this is the podcast for you. Moving on, we have Swift Unwrapped by JP Smart of Lyft and Jesse Squires. This is a more advanced podcast, we'll say, because they follow Swift evolution. If you're not familiar, Swift is open source, and how they bring in new features into Swift is called the Swift evolution process, where everything happens out in the open, and they talk about new features coming into Swift. So this is very like language level development, type podcast, and talking about the new upcoming features of Swift. And what I like about it is sometimes they'll even have like the Apple engineers on the Swift core team come on the show to explain, why they're implementing these features and kind of the thought process behind all that, which is fascinating stuff. So again, while this is maybe more of an advanced podcast, for those, again, this is a beginner course, I still recommend putting it on your radar and maybe even listening to it, just to, again, absorb it, expose yourself to it. But don't be discouraged if like 90% of it goes over your head. Even now, me 5 years into my career, like I would say half of it goes over my head. So it is more advanced, but I still think it's great because, again, what they talk about and who they bring on. And this comes out whenever. Like, I don't think they're on like a regular schedule, but definitely subscribe to it and you'll see it pop up in your feed. Next up, we have Stack Trace from John Sandel and Guy Rambo. Again, John Sandel's other podcast, but this is life and technology from a developer's perspective. That's their new tagline, but it's just a great conversation between two very knowledgeable and experienced developers about news, like maybe new Apple products coming out and how that's going to affect developers, or like a new framework that's coming out. For example, they're talking a lot about SwiftUI lately and their experiences in learning SwiftUI and trying to figure out what is the best architecture. Because again, SwiftUI is so new that we're still trying to figure out best practices as a community. And they talk about all that kind of stuff. At the end of the day, it's just a good conversation between two knowledgeable and experienced developers. And finally, we have the Swift Community Podcast, which is it's a podcast for the community, by the community. It's kind of like it's an interesting concept that it's an open sourced podcast, right? You can submit a topic for an episode, even recommend being the host of the episode by submitting a pull request into their GitHub repo. Like everything is done on the GitHub repo, talking about lining up guests, what topics they're going to do, who's going to edit the show. It's all open source, right? It's not just one or two people that run this podcast. So it's a unique concept. Still trying to figure it out. It's still early. It's only been around for a little bit, but it does come out sporadically because, again, it's kind of open source, so there's no like set schedule. But definitely check out the repo, and if you're interested in kind of breaking into the podcast space, maybe give it a shot. So those are the main podcasts I listen to. Of course, that's not all of them. There's way too many to list. So as usual, if you have a great podcast that you think other students will like, leave it in the comments. And again, if you're watching, don't skip over the comments. I'm sure there's great recommendations down there. See you in the next video. You just got a lot thrown at you, right? I get it. Like that was nearly 60 videos of just information. So it is perfectly normal to be feeling a little bit overwhelmed right now and feeling like you don't quite get it. But think about it, like you're learning an entire new skill, an entire new profession, like, and you're just at the beginning, right? You don't watch just a few hours of videos and then now you're good to go, right? This takes time, like I keep saying. And like I said, if you feel overwhelmed, perfectly normal. I mean, I remember like when I was doing my boot camp, I felt insanely overwhelmed. It was like drinking through a fire hose. Like I just was trying to keep my head above water. And to be perfectly honest with you, like I started questioning myself and wondering like, did I make a mistake trying to do this? Like, am I even cut out for this? And I'm so glad that I battled through those feelings. Because again, once you get through that, you're good to go. But we've all dealt with these feelings. So don't worry too much if you're, feeling overwhelmed or feeling like, oh man, I'm never going to get this stuff. Yes, you will. It'll just take time. And that's my biggest piece of advice kind of leaving this course is to be patient with yourself and stick with it. Like I said, this is a very long journey. You may have remembered me saying earlier in the course, like 6 months to 2 years is what it typically takes people. You're just at the beginning. Be patient with yourself. What you're going to see is slowly over time, like things will start clicking and things will start making sense. And here's the beauty of this course. You own it, right? It's not like you watch the videos once and then you never get to use it again, right? You can always come back to the videos. And in fact, I recommend it. I recommend going back and rewatching. I like to compare this to, you ever watch like a really complex movie or a TV show, like a Game of Thrones or Westworld, where the first time you watch it through, you're kind of like confused and like barely following the plot maybe, but if you go back and rewatch it a second time after you've already seen it, now you start to pick up on the things, now everything makes more sense, and now you understand it a lot more. This is the same exact thing. You just watched a kind of confusing and complex movie, so after watching it once, you might be like, I'm not really sure where I stand. Go back and rewatch it again, you're going to pick up a lot more. And this overwhelmed feeling you may be having is constant throughout your career. So get used to it, I guess is what I'm trying to say, because the only constant in technology is change, right? Things are constantly changing. And as a programmer and you're evolving with technology, like you're constantly going to be reset back to a beginner. Like maybe not all the way back to where you knew nothing, but like here's the example, right? Like when Swift was just announced, again, back in 2014, everybody was a beginner in Swift. Even just recently, summer of 2019, SwiftUI was announced. Everyone was a beginner at SwiftUI. So what I'm trying to say is get good at being a beginner, because that's going to be constant throughout your career, and kind of learn to deal with and evolve with this overwhelmed feeling, because you always get it every time you learn something new. And I think the key there is having the determination to battle through this overwhelmed feeling. Like I know some people like aren't willing to go back and rewatch videos or do a tutorial twice, right? They think they can just watch it once and then they know it. Like that's just not how it works. It's like any other skill. You have to practice and drill the fundamentals. So at the end of the day, don't worry about being overwhelmed. We've all felt this. It is perfectly normal. Be patient with yourself. Keep going. Take it little by little. And I guarantee you, 6 months later, you're going to look back and you're going to be amazed at how far you've come. So here you are, wrapping up your beginner course, and you're probably wondering, all right, what's the next step? What do I do next? And well, my first answer you might not like, but what I'm going to recommend, if this was your very first course, if you have a little bit more experience and this was reviewed for you, maybe not, but if you were the absolute beginner and this was like one of your very first courses, I'm going to say run it back. Like I mentioned in a previous video, you just watched a pretty complex movie, go watch it again and you're going to learn a lot more. You may not have to type everything out, but at least rewatching the videos, once you have all this knowledge now, is going to help you out a lot more. And I say to go run it back and rewatch those because I want to instill the habit, or maybe the lack of stigma, that going back and rewatching videos is not a bad thing. Like doing a tutorial twice, not a bad thing. Like I keep saying, repetition is key. You have to drill the fundamentals. Like this is how you get good at things. Think of something you're good at. I don't care, video games, sports, writing, whatever you are good at. Did you just do it a couple times and then you were good at it? No, you've practiced it for months, years, whatever, and then you got good at it. This is no different. So what I'm going to do is go back through the videos and add links to blog posts or other learning resources on each of the topics. If it's applicable, not all videos may have these links, but this is a way for you to go back and learn more about that specific topic. And this will be, other people's blog posts, etc. After you've revisited this course, I would recommend going to either hackingwithswift.com or raywunderlich.com. We talked about this in our iOS, resources section of the course, so hopefully those names are familiar to you, but they both have beginner content, whether it's books or videos. I recommend going through that. And even though there will be some crossover, some of it will be repetitive, what I have found when learning is that oftentimes hearing a different teacher explain something a different way will make things click. Because not only are they explaining it a different way, but you're coming into their content with some pre-existing knowledge, right, from this course. Or maybe if you've done their stuff first and you came to this one, right? Just hearing things explained different ways can really be helpful to make that click. And then after that, I may or may not have released this, but I have plans for what I'm calling a Beginner Plus course. And that is the next logical step on concepts after this course. If you're watching this in the first half of 2020, it's not released yet. I plan on releasing this in the second half of 2020. So depending on when you're watching this is if that's available. But if that is available, again, I'm designing that course to be the immediate next step to this course. So that might be a great next step. If not, again, check out Hacking with Swift or Ray Wunderlich. Again, check them out regardless. They have great stuff. Actually, you may have heard me say Ray Wunderlich back in 2015 is how I got my start, is how I learned. Now, after you've explored some of these beginner content, again, Hacking with Swift, Ray Wunderlich, my stuff, and some of the other resources I've put out there, the next big leap you're going to take in your learning is to create your own project. Now, I want to be clear. This does not have to be a world changing app. You don't have to create the next Instagram. This can be dead simple, but it needs to be your own idea. Something that you're not just following a tutorial on. Something that you say, I have this idea. How can I bring that idea to life? And you have to do the research in between to make that happen. But again, it can be super simple, and I actually recommend that it's simple. If you do think you're going to build the next Instagram and you concoct this crazy complex app, you're biting off more than you can chew. And that is very likely, of course you could pull it off, but it is very likely that is going to be more discouraging than helpful. Again, baby steps, long journey, little by little, you'll get there. But building your own project and again, solving your own problems where you don't have a tutorial that spells everything out for you, your learning will accelerate immensely. And that is you taking the next step in your journey. Then once you have the solid foundation, you've done those beginner courses, you've kind of built your own project, I would recommend coming back to my iOS developer take-home project course, the GitHub followers course, because that course was designed to be like the final boss before you start applying for your first real iOS developer job. That course is based on, a lot of times when you're interviewing, the company will send you a take-home project and they'll say, hey, you have 3 to 5 hours, build this project and send it back. And we kind of mimic that whole process, except we go a lot more in depth because again, this course is preparing you for the job interview. So we cover a lot of the main topics that are typically asked in iOS developer job interviews. So like I said, doing that course was designed to be like the final boss before you start applying. It's meant to prepare you for those junior developer job interviews. Now, of course, everyone's path is going to be different. The path I just laid out is very vague and rough, right? You did this beginner course. If my Beginner Plus course is out, take that. Even if it is out, explore Hacking with Swift, Ray Wunderlich, and some of the other iOS developer resources I put out there. Then start building your own project, your own idea. Keep the app simple. Then kind of round it back to my iOS developer take-home project. That's the rough, vague path. But again, it's vague. Make it your own. You don't have to do exactly that, but that is a good roadmap, if you will, to potentially have your full-time job be an iOS developer. And along the way, again, be sure to partake in the community. That's one of my biggest regrets. I didn't start partaking in Twitter and interacting with other iOS developers until I was like 2 years into my career. And I look back, that is one of my biggest regrets. So I implore you, don't be afraid. Hop in the Slack channel, start interacting with us in there. Again, interact on Twitter, like I say in my Twitter video. Trust me, that will pay off in the long run. And then finally, like I said before, I want to stress this, just be patient with yourself. Again, this is a long journey. You've heard me say 6 months to 2 years typically, and I've seen it firsthand. People that have been following me and my YouTube channel, I've watched their whole journey go from I'm just learning to now they're hired full-time iOS developers. Like, it happens every day. So again, be patient. It's worth it. Congratulations, you've completed the course. You've officially begun your journey. Your rocket's taken off. It's exciting times. And I do want to take a second to sincerely thank you. Like, I really enjoy teaching this stuff. I love watching the progression of the students, be it via the comments or the Slack channel. Like, watching students have that I call it that click moment where you can see the light bulb go off and they finally get it, like that's the value I get. So, I hope you got value from this course and you may be thankful to me for teaching you. Just know that I'm getting just as much, if not more value, just watching the progression of you all. And again, like I said in previous videos, I've watched people go from knowing nothing to now they're 2 years into their career as an iOS developer. And that is so rewarding. So please keep in touch either via Twitter, the Slack channel, like keep us updated on your journey. Like not only me, but everybody else in the community, like love seeing that. Now, for those of you that may not know, this was just the second course I've ever made, the first one being the GitHub Followers course. Now, my audacious goal, I'll admit, is I'm trying to create the best, most premium iOS developer courses, frankly, in the world. I know that's a lofty, audacious goal, but that's what I'm striving for. So I'm absolutely not there yet. Again, this was just my second course, but what I'm going to ask of you, and here's my email, is please provide me some feedback and be brutal. Like I can take it. Like I said, if you're trying to be, the best, you got to be able to take the tough feedback. So please let me know, what did you enjoy about the course? Like, what should I do more of? And more importantly, I think like this is the feedback that I actually look forward to, is the bad stuff. Like, what did you think was too confusing? Do you think I explained something in a wrong way? Just what did you not like about the course? Like, to be quite honest, even though a lot of people don't like sending that email, those are the ones I like getting, because that is how I improve, by fixing all those things. So please, I would love to hear your feedback. And then also, while my email is up there, if you did enjoy the course and you want to leave a testimonial that I can post on a page so future potential students, when they're looking at the course, they can see, let me know. Or just email me a real short blurb, like 2 sentences, and I will put it up there as testimonials on the course. And then finally, if you enjoyed yourself while you were taking this, please tweet about it, share your experience, talk about what you liked about it. I'm happy to jump in there, retweet it. It just really helps spread the word and get my courses out there and more people exposed to, again, what I'm trying to build here with some of the best courses in the world. That's the goal. I'm not claiming that I'm there yet, so I hope I don't get emails like, you're nowhere near that. Like, I know that's just the long-term goal. We're trying to get better. But again, thank you so much for coming on this journey with me, and I really hope I get to see you in future courses. Ezra Black was homeless in a car, in a McDonald's parking lot, stealing Wi-Fi, learning how to code, and now here he is, full-time developer, making well into the 6 figures. He reached out to me about 2 years ago and told me the beginning of his story, before he got that job. And I told him, no, we'll have you on the channel, let your story finish. Well, here we are about 2 years later. Welcome to the channel, Ezra. Happy to have you. I want to throw it to you right away, because again, what stuck out to me about your story was in a car, in McDonald's, stealing Wi-Fi, watching YouTube videos, learning how to code. So just how'd you get there? And yeah, just start talking about that.
Yeah, I ended up getting into the position due to Scottrade. I was working for the Scottrade investment firm. I was doing security work for them through Allied Universal and working in their technology fields, just, being the guard there. And that got me really interested in the technologies and getting to be around, the kind of environments that technology brings. And then Scottrade closed in 2017. And whenever they closed, I didn't have a backup. So I found myself, dealing with a strenuous situation of money and income, working like small contract jobs, doing things like that, and messing around with coding. Like I was building like little video games on Unity and stuff like that, which I really enjoyed. But it wasn't really aggressively in my mind to be something that I really wanted to focus on. Once the mother of my child, though, separated from me, I didn't have nowhere else to go, and I started living in my car. That's whenever it really started to accelerate. I started doing, little teeny courses and things like that, and I built a xylophone app for my daughter when I was younger. So that's kind of what hit it off, was this xylophone app that I wanted to build for my daughter, so she wouldn't use my phone no more. And we find ourselves here now.
So was it always iOS, or were you, I guess, yeah, how did you end up in iOS and not Android or web?
Good question. So honestly, I kind of did a little bit of research. I wanted to do mobile development because it was the only device I had. So I didn't have nothing else with me to actually code with. But I looked at how much they make. So I'm completely, checked the field, I checked Glassdoor, I checked all that other stuff. I just wanted to be able to make enough to really support my family and be able to support myself as well. So iOS just ended up being the smarter choice.
So talk about like just flat out, what is it like coding out of a car, stealing McDonald's Wi-Fi? Like how reliable was it? Like was it constantly, were you watching YouTube videos and it would buffer all the time?
Yeah, definitely. So I started with Angela Yu courses, eventually led into your courses, just searching for things through, needs that I had for hers. And that actually led into needing better Wi-Fi. So I was doing the McDonald's needs. They were letting me use it 3 or 4 hours out of the day, and then I'd kind of sit in my car and get close to the building, So they didn't like that too much. I ended up making
So
some
they knew
enemies.
you were using it though. You weren't like, being sly about it. They knew what was going on?
Except at nighttime. So eventually though, they did start cutting their Wi-Fi on me because I had like 2 or 3 people out there that started figuring it out. So there was like a lot of people huddling around the building and using the Wi-Fi and everything. I had a friend though that went to the a community college right across the street, and I eventually convinced him, like I was like, hey, I really want to get into this coding. I'm trying real hard. I showed him some of the example tutorial apps I was building, and he was down for letting me use his login credentials at the community college. So I was able to use that Wi-Fi for the last stint before I finally signed up for the coding school that I went to.
Back to the YouTube a little bit. Like you said, Angela Yu courses, my courses. The reason I want to go to this is not to brag about my courses, but I like to tell people that like YouTube is so powerful, right? I call it YouTube University.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of people think you need the computer science degree and all that stuff. It's like, man, everything is for free on YouTube, or even the courses are relatively cheap when you compare it to, going to school for it. So I guess maybe dive into more about what videos you were watching as far as like tutorials or even like motivational videos to inspire you. Like what were you watching?
You had a video before your courses. I speak about those. You had a video talking about how you became an iOS engineer in 7 months. And that really opened my eyes. And I can remember I was actually sitting in a McDonald's with like 4 old people next to me. And they were talking about funny things. And the guy next to me, I can remember he even told me, he goes, that guy's telling you a whole bunch of malarkey. That's what he said. And he was like, you need to go out and get a job, and everything else like that, and get off your laptop. And I was just laughing because I was like, maybe
he was saying
right.
about me on the video?
He was like, oh, you're just listening to,
funny.
Some older man. And yeah, but definitely just general motivational videos and stuff like that. But within coding world, it was definitely you, of course, and Paul. So Paul was a really big inspiration as well and a really big help. Just having the information out there was what really hit it off for me, realizing that all these different people that were already really far into the field or, really established were providing these kind of resources and really making it seem like it was a transparent path was what really led me on to feeling like I could do this,
How did you handle like meeting other developers, right? Because obviously there's probably not too many of them sitting in a McDonald's parking lot. Like how did you go about, because you probably get stuck watching these tutorials or courses and you need to reach out for help. So how did you go about that?
So it started with Twitter. Angela talks about, doing the courses and everything, and as well as you talking about how you do social medias. I had a Twitter before already for years, so I was like, well, maybe I should just really get into this. So I focused a lot on building my Twitter and following different iOS engineers. I kind of just stalked everybody's followers, and went through and found every iOS engineer I could find, shoving random questions down people's throats that they probably don't want to hear. A lot of it definitely was just getting into the internet side of things because I got lucky. Well, I guess I shouldn't say lucky. Let's not call this lucky. But COVID happened. So I was homeless, and whenever COVID occurred, everything went online. And because everything went online, I was able to get a lot more of a quality of interaction with the community, which is what really hyper accelerated and like propelled it forward.
You said those keywords I was going to ask you about. You said propelled it forward. I was going to ask, like, how did you, you're sitting in the McDonald's parking lot, and then like you said, you eventually got to do the community college Wi-Fi. What was kind of like the big break, or at least the start of the big break that started to propel you forward?
I think my first big break was getting into Lambda because I started the Lambda boot camp. And they have like a 6-month, 9-month course, and getting accepted into that.
Real quick, you said it was a big break. Was there a stringent application process? Why was it a big break just to get in?
Well, I've never really accomplished too much in my life academically at the time. And they did have like a huge like beginner course that you had to do. At the time, I thought it was a lot bigger than what it was. But it was the first thing that I ever did and like had a reflection on like, hey, this is something that you're valid with. This is something that you can do. And getting done with that crash course in the beginning, they had like 60 iOS questions, and like a basic app thing you had to do. Accomplishing that and being told like, hey, we're going to accept you. And knowing that I was sleeping in my car, and then seeing all the other people that were there, hey, I'm in my car and these people, have beautiful desks already and setups and, all the gear and everything. And I'm on equal level with them. So that was really like I can do these things even in a more stringent environment. And because of that, it made me feel like I was like, hey, this is something I can really do. This is something that I'm good at. It was the validation outside of myself.
So you're into Lambda. Talk about the boot camp process.
So that's what's really interesting as well, is that once Lambda started, that's whenever COVID started getting really big. I started interacting with different people in the community, and I ended up meeting a girl named Zoe through the internet that I ended up starting dating. I think it was beginning of 2020. That was whenever like the boot camp was starting to ramp up and everything. So I had a little bit more comfortability once it actually started to ramp up. But the experience in Lambda in general, and like the coding experience, was pretty solid. I'm not gonna lie. Like after I got out and got to experience like the real environment, they did a pretty okay job at like getting you the blanket understanding of things and having a good syllabus. But the school was just not accommodating for how I learn, and the fact that I was just getting out of a situation that I got out of, and dealing with rehabilitating myself into normality, and then on top of it, COVID happening. Moving, I moved from St. Louis area to Springfield to be around Zoe, and starting Lambda hardcore in general made it just, it was something I couldn't accommodate myself to no more. So I kind of just took what I knew and then what was left in the syllabus and kind of went wild on the internet. I dropped out of the school, did the hacking with Swift, and just grinded out that last little bit and started doing interviews.
So it sounds like that wasn't a setback, because I would have thought, quitting or leaving the boot camp would have, set you back, because we just talked about how that was such a big accomplishment getting in, but it sounds like you just kind of kept it moving, didn't knock you back too far.
And what I realized was that I wasn't there to get the piece of paper. I was there to learn. Once I knew, I felt like I was comfortable and strong in my understanding of what I can and can't do with coding and how you teach yourself, I just hit the races, I was able to take the syllabus and realize I was like, hey, I got 4 more months left of this. If I drop out now, I can hyper accelerate myself through this whole situation that's going on with COVID and have a potential chance to, just break out of this tutorial chaos,
After the boot camp, you started going on interviews. And I know one of the questions I get asked all the time, because, most of my audience is trying to get that first job, is how do you even get these interviews? So talk through how you got these interviews and how that led to maybe even more interviews.
Yeah, so I kind of wanted to stand out. That's an interesting question. I started getting really interested in my own fields and everything, which was automation and augmented reality. So I kind of fiddled with both of those to stand out. Since I didn't have a degree or nothing, what I started doing was I would do man-in-the-middle proxy attacks on their application. And then I would go through all their JSON, everything that goes out publicly on the phone. And I would structure everything and tell them what tools they're using and everything else like that. And instead of just having, my resume, I would give them a cover letter, which was a diagnosis of their application, or, anything I might have found, or the technologies that they use and why they interest me, just the journey of exploring their application and telling them I enjoyed, the technologies and what they're using. That usually really was a standout thing. I got so many interviews that way. I didn't get the jobs, but I definitely got the interviews, just, somebody being all like, who in the world is this guy? So that was definitely a good idea. Just try to stand out a little bit. That's it.
I kind of say that about my YouTube channel, my Twitter, and the brand and everything like that. I can get an interview pretty much everywhere. Whether I get the job or not, well, that's up to me, right? But all you can ask for is the chance. Do whatever you can to stand out to get that chance. And then, the interview is a whole nother story, but at least you got the chance.
Yeah, I've seen people in interviews come in and, they just have that amount of charisma that they can understand things. Or, you go into jobs and you don't understand the frameworks that they are using. People can teach people how to code. Can we teach you how to take ownership? Can we teach you how to, be responsible for what you work in, to be passionate? Those are things you can't teach people.
Now, if we back up a little bit, this thought just occurred to me. You're homeless, living in a car, sitting at McDonald's. iOS development's not a cheap game to get into, right? You have to have a MacBook. You have to have an iPhone. How the hell did that happen? Connect those dots for me.
Definitely. So what was wild is I had an old 2010 MacBook that I got from a friend. I used it for a little bit and it would not run Xcode for nothing.
I can't imagine how frustrating that would be, running Xcode on that old machine, just thinking about it.
Oh man, and it had the light up logo and everything. So, I'm sitting at McDonald's with it, just feeling cool. I thought the light up logo was still new and modern. And I found this guy on Twitter named Bill Pult, and he's a multimillionaire and he's a philanthropist. He gives away money on Twitter to people in need. I posted on one of his things or tweeted on it, and I said, I need a new pair of shoes and I need to get a MacBook for school. And I gave him a screenshot of my application. The next day I woke up and I had $500 in my Cash App. And I was able to take that money with my tax return. And then I took the old laptop to a pawn shop and I was able to get myself a 2019 MacBook Air.
Now you're off and running, 2019 MacBook Air. Still not the greatest development machine, but better than what you had. You also talked about getting these interviews with standing out, but you also said you didn't get any of the jobs. So how did you actually get your very first job? Because what I led with at the very beginning of the show was this, mid six-figure job. That's where you're at currently, but there was a job before that. So how did you get that?
Through Twitter again. I was using Twitter to utilize like the networking and just, being a part of the community. And I ended up finding I think it was Cyril and another person that did a Twitter iOS hackathon. And I had a friend named Nadim, and Nadim and I ended up joining up with Alex Silver and Sam McGarry. And we did the iOS hackathon, and we had a application called AR Deck. It was really fun. We built it in 24 hours. And Nadim is like the most amazing developer. He's the smartest developer I've ever met for his age, truly. So we built this application in 24 hours and somehow won. And I was just as surprised as all of us were. There was really great competition going on in there, and all that networking and all the new followers I got led me to Zach Becker, who to this day, I couldn't give back to that man, more than I could because Zach noticed me and told me, he just started chatting with me and everything and asked me about my developer life and like what I've done. And I explained my life to him, my story, and he kind of, told me that he was trying to pay it forward and felt like I could do the work really well. And he gave me a recommendation to apply for PK Global, which is one of the contractors for T-Mobile. So I went off with the races again. I applied, and shockingly enough, they called me back and I got the job.
So you mentioned that this was a contracting company for T-Mobile. So I guess when I hear contracting, I think building a bunch of random apps for a developer agency. But it sounds like you were working at T-Mobile, just not as a full-time employee, as a contractor. So how long did you do that? Because spoiler alert, you are a full-time employee at T-Mobile right now. How long did that take, and what was the process of getting hired full-time?
In contracting, you do kind of get thrown on random teams and everything, and I was lucky enough to be thrown on the retail frontline experience. So I got to genuinely work with and I still work with the application that we have across 8,000 plus T-Mobile stores. It's the front-facing application that's used on the iPads across every single store, what the employees themselves use to actually sell your phone, purchase your phones, trade your phones in, upgrade your phones. So I was able and lucky enough to be on a team that's important. I know there's a lot of microservices and everything. So I had a lot of opportunity to really take ownership of my work. We had, I was doing automation work at first, and we didn't have an automation team that was really big. We didn't have anybody that was really leading automation at all. And, I guess this comes a little bit with naivety and also with just, excitement. I don't know if, I was 5 years into development in a company this big, I probably wouldn't have done this again. But I just jumped up at the idea of, well, hey, I could, we can do this and this, and, this is important to me, and I want this to be done because, without this getting done, this won't get done. And just taking ownership of things. In about 7 to 8 months, I got a request, and it was asked if I wanted to go full-time. And I accepted. I didn't even think about it, actually, or the repercussions.
Jumped on it, yeah.
Yep, I jumped on it so quick, and I woke up a month later, and I'm living in Seattle across the country, and definitely has changed my whole life, that's for sure. I'm really thankful for you. I'm thankful for everything.
I appreciate that. And that's awesome. Here you are. That's where you are right now. That's kind of the whole story, getting you up to present. And I just want to recap, you mentioned it earlier. Not only do you not have like a college degree, I think you said you don't even have a high school degree or a GED, right? And you're from homeless in a McDonald's parking lot stealing Wi-Fi. So now here you are, full-time software developer, mid six figures. Like that's an amazing story. And like I said, I'm so happy to share this. I can't wait to see like the comments and the reaction. Like, I think it's awesome. So not to discount like how far you've come in this awesome story, but I got to ask, like, what's next? What are the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years have in store for Ezra? Like, where do you want to go?
Yeah, definitely. I think that I'm going to focus on stability and financial growth. And in terms of my career and everything, augmented reality is right around the corner, and that's where I like to focus. I enjoy fiddling with all of the bleeding edge technologies, and a lot of my obsession right now is in LiDAR. So hopefully once we start getting like the hardware to catch up with the software, there'll be a whole new wave of something for me to enjoy and maybe ride that wave as well. So we'll see, but it's probably going to be something to do with augmented reality.
I've kind of been watching from the sidelines a little bit. Like I said at the beginning, you reached out probably 2 years ago, telling me where you're at with your story, and kind of been, keeping tabs a little bit here and there. And it's just awesome to see kind of like it all come to fruition with where you are now, again, making well into the six figures. So I know you're excited to share your story, but I'm just as excited. Like I said, I can't wait for people to hear this. And I think it's going to be inspiring to so many people.
You know, that's all I really hope for. I mean, if it wasn't for your videos and getting inspired myself, I wouldn't have had nothing, you know? And I feel like everything starts in your mind, because it obviously does. And if you just have that a little bit of drive and focus and the want to have better and stop discounting your future, you're going to get places. Just focus.
It's a great way to end it. Well, I appreciate you coming on, Ezra, and we'll see you all in the next video.
Yep, definitely. Appreciate you.
What's going on, everybody? Today we're rattling off 37 tips or pieces of advice for junior software engineers. And whenever you put together a list like this, of course, there's going to be some exceptions. So if you have some thoughts about my tips, leave a comment. Let's have a discussion. Throw 10 minutes on the clock and get right into this. I got a list right in front of me, and these are really in no particular order. But number one, don't worry about memorizing things, right? I think a lot of people think that they have to know how to build everything off the top of their head. They just go there and type. No. Even the most senior developers Google the most basic stuff all the time. The key here, you got to know where to find it, whether that's previous projects or you know where to go in the documentation. That's the name of the game. Know where to find it. Don't worry about memorizing. Number two, you got to learn how to learn, right? This industry is constantly evolving. Technology is constantly changing. The one thing that will be constant is that you're going to have to learn new stuff all the time in this career. So learn how you learn, whether you're an audio learner, you like to read books, you like to watch videos. Figure out the best way you learn things and get really good at that, because you're never going to stop learning in this career. And number three, sticking with the learning topic, repetition is key, right? You don't just learn one thing in programming and then you know it, right? You know it by doing it over and over and over and over again. Repetition is the key. Number four, don't fall into the tutorial trap. I think a lot of people, when they're just learning, do this tutorial, do that tutorial. They just do endless tutorials. Your learning will really take a leap when you start building your own projects. When there's no cookie cutter recipe for you to follow, you got to figure it out on your own. That's when you're going to take the leap as a developer. Number five, and this will help you get out of that tutorial trap, is learn how to read the documentation for your language. I understand not every language's documentation is created equal. Some are great, some are not so great, but that's what you got to work with. And knowing how to read the documentation, how to use the documentation as a resource, again, that gets you out of the tutorial trap. You're not relying on other people's tutorials. You can dive into the documentation and figure it out for yourself. That is a vital skill. Number six, this goes along the lines of once you're actually working on a project, is learn to understand the cost-benefit analysis of your work. A good way to think about that is each feature has like a spectrum of complexity, right? You may have an idea for a feature. There may be a super simple, easy to implement version of that. It may not be as robust as you want it, but again, you got to manage how much time it's going to take you to build it versus the benefits you're going to get. So along that spectrum of super simple, basic version to really complex, robust version, there's a whole spectrum of versions in the middle. So learning to balance that cost-benefit analysis of the time you're putting into it is key when you're building products. Number seven, let's talk about the am I a junior developer, mid-level developer, senior developer? When can I call myself what? I think that's an irrelevant question. Don't even worry about that. You could ask 10 different developers. You're probably going to get 10 different answers. It's very abstract, very vague. Stop wasting your time thinking about that. Number eight, find a mentor if you can, whether you have somebody in person that you met at a meetup or, maybe build a relationship with somebody on Twitter. Finding a mentor early on can make or break your career. And along those lines, number nine, join Twitter. Developers hang out on Twitter. It's where they talk and communicate. It's an amazing place to network, especially if you don't live in a development hub. But use this as to build relationships over time. Like I consider Twitter probably the most powerful tool in my developer career. Just the people I've met, the networking I've done. I've gotten job interviews for DMing people I know on Twitter. It's amazing. Build your Twitter, join the community, be active, be known. It's one of the most important things in my opinion. Moving on to number 10, go to meetups if you can. I understand you have to be in a bigger city to probably do this, and Twitter's a good backup if you're not, but if you can go to in-person meetups, so valuable. Your network is your net worth. I mean, so many career opportunities happen based on, I met so-and-so at a meetup and then I got a job. Like it's real, it happens. Go to meetups if you can. Number 12 might be the most important on this list, and I genuinely believe in this, but if you're a junior developer, you have to create a very visual portfolio website. You got to showcase your work. And apparently, I don't know how to count. That was tip number 11, not number 12. Off by one errors, am I right? Anyway, tip number 12 is to create smaller portfolio projects. I believe you need to create a lot of smaller projects that can demonstrate a lot of different skills and showcase that on your portfolio. Don't get me wrong, there's value in shipping a full product, like actually completing it. But at the same time, if you do that, you may only have one. I think it's also good to show many different examples of what you can do. Moving on to tip number 13, that is your GitHub repo readmes. Make them visual. Put in pictures of the website or app you're working on. Animated GIFs are even better to show in action, but it's pretty bad when you go to a GitHub repo, the README is empty, or if it's just a paragraph, and then you got to dig in the code to figure out what it is. Having nice looking pictures or animated GIFs to see the project in action in the README, awesome. Do that. And number 14 is along those lines and just in general, but I think developers should have a basic level of design skills. I'm not saying you need to be a professional designer, but you should have some understanding of design, in my opinion, if you're making consumer products like apps or websites. All right, let's talk about some job stuff. Number 15, and this goes out to those that are trying to get that first developer job, because this is hard, I get it, but try to find the right fit, not the first offer for your first job. And I know it's hard to get that first developer job. So the first offer you get is amazing. You're super pumped. Like, hell yeah, I'll take anything. I'm going to ask you to fight that a little bit, because your very first job can either catapult you and launch you or hold you back because you learn bad habits and it's not a good experience. It can really make a difference in the direction of your career. Number 16 is along those lines, and it's maybe a controversial one. I'm sure I'll get some pushback in the comments, but take less money if you have to, if it's the right fit. Just using some American, maybe San Francisco numbers for junior developers. Say maybe a job is $75,000 one offer, but it's an amazing fit, and another offer is $90,000 a year, but it's kind of a crappy fit and doesn't look great. Like, yeah, $15,000 a year is a decent amount of money in difference, but I'm telling you, it will compound over time to take the less money for the much better team, better product, better fit. That is going to outpace that extra 15 grand by a mile in the long run. All right, number 17, and I may get some pushback for this as well, but I think you should spend an early chapter, and again, a chapter of your career in a major tech hub. The San Franciscos, Austins, London, a big city with a lot of tech in it. And, of course, there's pros and cons with that. Usually those are very expensive, but the network you're going to get living in a tech hub is amazing, and again, can compound over the whole course of your career. So I understand people may not want to live in a large city like San Francisco because it's expensive, but just do 2, 3, 4 years there and then move on. And just like I said, the network you're going to get and take with you for the rest of your career, so worth it. Number 18 is a contracting, freelancing kind of tip. I would do a full-time job first and start contracting and freelancing on the side as like a side hustle to kind of feel it out, get used to it before jumping in full-time. I think a lot of people want to start their careers as full-time remote contractors managing the project themselves. That is the dream. I understand why you'd want that. Again, for the long-term health of your career, I think it's very beneficial to start off at a company, do the contracting as a side hustle for a little bit, and then switch. Number 19 is just a general tip throughout your career, and that is show initiative. Show that you care about the project. So if you're a junior developer on a project and you want to implement this one feature, go to your senior developer and say, hey, I want to implement this feature. I think it'd be really great. I put a lot of thought into it. I think we could do it this way, this way, this way. What do you think? Even if they turn you down, just showing the initiative is going to be valuable, and just apply that to all kinds of cases, again, throughout your whole career. Number 20 is another crazy important skill, and just in life, and that is learn to communicate better. If you can, as an engineer, break down these complex engineering problems and explain that to either project managers or maybe the CEO if you're in a smaller startup, and making them understand why this is taking so long, or the trade-offs between solution A and solution B. Being able to explain that to engineers is one thing. You got to do that too. But being able to break it down into, layman's terms for non-engineers and helping them understand, again, that will make you so valuable to your company. Number 21, again, when you're working on a team, just show that you care. And this kind of goes along with the showing the initiative, but we all know that person you work with or have worked with in the past that you can tell they're here for the 9-to-5 job. They hate being here. They're just here for the paycheck. They don't care about what's going on. You've worked with that person. Hopefully you weren't that person, but don't be that person. Because again, your reputation will follow you through your whole career. So if you are showing initiative, you show that you're passionate about your work, that's going to go a long way for your career. And along those lines, number 22, impress everywhere you go. Like I just mentioned, your reputation will follow you, especially if you're in a tech hub like San Francisco or any other city. It's a small community. Your reputation is a big deal. So at every stop, whether that's a contract or, a company, do your best to put your best foot forward and impress people. Number 23 is a common misconception. You're not too old. I started learning how to code at 32 years old. I get questions from people all the time that are 24 that think they're way too old. And I had this misconception as well. I thought you had to be a child math prodigy to be a computer programmer. That is not the case. And a lot of people are worried about age discrimination in Silicon Valley. I don't see that. In fact, a lot of the engineers I work with are late 20s, early 30s, 40s. Like I think it's stereotypical to think it's for young people. It's really not. Number 24, another beneficial thing you can do for your career, if you can do it, this one's not for everybody, but that is to create content and build an online presence. That can be many things. That can be a blog. That can be a podcast. That can be YouTube videos. You can just have a great Instagram profile. Having an online presence and kind of being known within your developer community, whether that's Swift, JavaScript, whatever, Android, having that online presence and being known, hopefully known in a good way, again, will benefit you. It's another way to network. You'll get a lot of opportunities if you become a known presence in your community. Number 25, if you're still learning or trying to get that first job, be patient. This is a long journey. So many people ask, how can I become a developer as fast as possible? That's the wrong attitude to have. This is a long journey, but I promise you, it's worth it at the end. Number 26, let's talk about the 90-90 rule. Some people call it the 80-20 rule. This has been called many different things, but the point remains the same. When you're building software, there's the first 90%, and then there's the second 90%. The first 90% is getting like most of the features done. It feels like it's so close to being done. The second 90% is all the air handling, the polish, adjusting for different screen sizes. You think it's a lot of little nitpicky stuff, but it really adds up into being like the second 90% of the project. It's a lot, and it really sneaks up on a lot of junior developers. Number 27, should you learn this language or that language? It doesn't really matter, to be honest with you. If you do what you enjoy the most, my example, I enjoyed iOS development. I like the iPhone, so I wanted to build for that. If you do what you enjoy, you're going to become good at it, most likely. If you ever have to switch languages, learning that second language is infinitely easier than learning how to program for the first time. So switching later on down the line could be relatively easy if you have to do that. Number 28, let's talk about getting job interviews. Don't go through the front door if you don't have to. What is the front door? That is going to airbnb.com/apply. That's very hard to break through that way. Again, back to networking on Twitter. If you start to get to know engineers at these companies, build a relationship with them, DM them, say, hey, can you refer me for a job? Most likely they'll say yes, and that's pretty much a guaranteed interview, and then it's up to you. Number 29, when you're learning, I suggest completely immersing yourself, watching YouTube videos, subscribing to newsletters, subscribing to blogs, just completely soak up everything you can. And along with that, number 30, let's talk about podcasts. Podcasts are a great way to immerse yourself because you can multitask with podcasts. Commuting to work, throw on a developer podcast. Going out for a walk, throw on a developer podcast. So podcasts are a great way to immerse yourself. Number 31, when it comes to getting contracts when you're ready, your personal and professional network will be the best. And by best, I mean getting opportunities, but also getting quality opportunities. Going on sites like Upwork, you never know what you're going to get. You could get some really crappy projects, but if you're recommended by a friend or a former coworker to another company, those are going to be quality contracts. And that is how I've gotten all my contracts. Number 32, should you work at a small startup or a big company? As with any programming question, it depends. If you like to wear many hats, you consider yourself a generalist, you want to build the whole app or the whole website, that's a small startup. If you want to work on a very large team, on a large company, and be very specialized, that's a big company. So your personal preference comes into play. Also, obviously the larger company, probably a larger paycheck, but maybe more stressful. Smaller startup, smaller paycheck, could be less or more stressful, it depends. Number 33, preparing for job interviews. Big tip. It takes months to prepare for these data structures and algorithms questions. Practice, 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 practice. What I've done in the past that has messed me up is 2 weeks before the interview, I'm like, okay, I'll start studying. That is not enough time. Give yourself a couple months, not a couple weeks. Number 34, remote work has its downsides, right? It's the dream to work wherever you want, whenever you want, remotely. That sounds like the dream, and it is fun for like 6 months. It's like the honeymoon period. After doing it for a year or two, it really starts to have its drawbacks. The loneliness, you're by yourself most of the time, not working with people. And again, that may sound great, but after a long time of that, it starts to wear on you. Number 35, is a dev bootcamp worth it? What I have found, the knowledge you get, no, it's not worth that $10,000 potentially. However, forcing you to do it every day for 8 to 10 hours for X amount of weeks, getting the experience of working with other people, that is absolutely worth it. So if you think you can be a good self-starter and learn on your own, I think you should probably save the 10 grand. However, if you like the extra push to force yourself to do it for 8 to 10 hours a day, I think a bootcamp is worth it. And number 36, after all these tips, it gets easier. Like, experience in this industry matters, right? This may have been an overwhelming video throwing a lot at you, and I know you may be learning and it may feel overwhelming, but before you know it, you're going to wake up and 5 years has gone by and you're like, holy crap, I know a lot of stuff now. So it does get easier. Stick with it, I promise. And of course, number 37 is to subscribe to this YouTube channel or any other developer YouTube channels. Again, immerse yourself. I put out iOS development content specifically, but I do talk about general software engineering stuff a lot as well. So those are my 37 quick tips. I hope you got something out of this. Let me know in the comments if you disagreed with anything. Let's have a discussion. We'll see you in the next video. When it comes to my technical skills, I'm an average developer. Like if there was a normal distribution bell curve, I'd be parked right at the top of that thing, right? I'm not great, nothing special, but I'm not bad either, just average. However, I think I'm a really good developer overall. And that's what we're gonna talk about in this video because I wanna maybe dispel some misconceptions that are out there. So like I said, my technical skills, they're fine, right? Nothing special, not bad, just average. However, I think there's a misconception out there, I don't know, probably because I create content and put out a lot of stuff that I just know so much. And again, this is the misconception that I want to dispel, right? Because I get DMs, emails, comments on YouTube asking like very specific questions about all kinds of frameworks. And then as you know, like there's a whole ocean of knowledge that you can have. Like it's impossible to know everything about everything. And again, this is the misconception that I want to hopefully dispel in this video. The more experience I gain, the more I realize that like I don't know much. And there's a difference between knowing something, like having it memorized, versus being able to figure things out quickly and being a quick learner. And again, this is the misconception that I want to dispel because I know a lot of you out there are probably just learning software development or just learning Swift, or you're earlier in your career and you're probably very self-conscious about your knowledge, right? You probably look at these developers on Twitter or content creators and you think to yourself like, wow, I don't know nearly as much as they do. And you're self-conscious about your knowledge. Well, again, I want to say that like, you don't have to know much, but there's a couple keys. Even if your knowledge is mediocre or less, there's some things you can do as a developer to make yourself really, really good. And I alluded to one of those just a little bit ago, and that is your ability to learn. Like I said, I don't know much off the top of my head, like ARKit, for example. I don't know anything about that. However, I'm confident if I were to get tasked with building an AR app, like I would dive into the documentation, I would read books. Like I'm very confident that I would be able to pick up that knowledge and skill set relatively quickly. And I think that's the big thing, is learning how to learn. Whether you learn by reading books or watching videos or diving into documentation or listening to podcasts, like figure out how you learn, because the ability to pick up new skills and new knowledge relatively quickly is a huge part of being a developer. You don't have to have every framework out there memorized. And besides learning how to pick things up quickly, there's a whole slew of soft skills that I believe are at least half of the equation, right? There's your technical skills and then there's your soft skills. And that's where, even though I say my technical skills are average, I believe my soft skills are way, way, way above average. And that's what I think makes me a good developer overall, even though my technical skills, like I said, they're fine, they're average. And those are skills that you can work on, right? Like your communication skills, like having the ability to break down complex technical topics, not only to maybe more junior developers or other technical people, but other non-technical people at your company or on your team. For example, I spend a lot of time in small startups, so I'm constantly having to communicate to, the CEO, the trade-offs between how complex we want to make this feature, right? Because what happens with, marketing and product people or co-founders, like they want to add features. Well, it's up to you as a developer to properly communicate like, hey, that's fine, we can add this feature, but we're either going to have to get rid of another feature or make some trade-offs because we have a launch date that we got to hit. And if we keep adding features, like we're going to miss that launch date. And properly communicating that and having those discussions is an insanely valuable skill for a developer. And of course, the number one thing you can control is your work ethic, right? You can just be a hard worker. Back to that ability to pick things up quickly, diving into books, learning new things, like that work ethic and that drive, like you can control that. You can improve on that. And then other soft skills, like the passion you have for your job and your craft, also being a good teammate. Like it doesn't matter how great of a developer you are. If you're a horrible teammate and you're a horrible person, you're bad to work with, like you're going to be a net negative on your overall team, no matter how good your skills are. Another soft skill you can work on is showing initiative, right? Don't always wait and sit back and be told what to do. Now, I'm not saying go rogue, but if you're a junior developer, like go to your senior developers or go to your team and say, hey, I had this idea. I want to research it. I want to look into building this. What do you think? And showing the initiative will go a long way towards making yourself a more well-rounded developer if you feel like you're lacking in your technical knowledge. And then, of course, you can start researching UI, UX, design, overall product stuff. Again, because this is right? We're talking about making up for a lack of technical knowledge. Well, again, there's a lot more that goes into being a developer than just knowing the code, right? Understanding, like I said, the UI, UX, the product, design. Like start studying that. Start getting very, very good at that. Because again, that makes you more well-rounded. And then lastly, when it comes to getting that job or getting the next job or winning that contract, like the ability to market yourself is such a big deal. And having a great online presence and developer portfolio really goes a long way with that. So again, I consider myself an average developer when it comes to just straight up technical skills. And if you feel that way too, or you feel self-conscious about your technical skills, of course you can still work to improve them. I'm not saying you have to know nothing and not work at that, but there's many other things you can do, like the soft skills we talked about and learning how to learn how to pick up things very, very quickly to kind of make yourself a more well-rounded developer. What's going on, everybody? Sean here. Today we're going to talk about 9 things that I wish I knew when I started out programming. Would have saved me so much time. So let's just dive right into the list. And the first thing that I would recommend to my former self is to not stay in what I call the tutorial trap for so long. What is the tutorial trap? Well, I think a lot of us fall into this where we just enjoy learning, right? We like learning new things. So we see this bright new shiny toy and it's like, oh, let me do a tutorial on that. And when you're just learning, don't get me wrong, you have to start out on tutorials. That's how you learn, right? But what you may find yourself falling into is just tutorial after tutorial after tutorial. You've been doing that for 6 months and you haven't built anything on your own. When I decided to build my own app, my own idea, where I couldn't just follow a recipe of a tutorial, like a to-do list, a paint by numbers, my learning skyrocketed. You know, I was forced to take the ideas in my head and make them happen on an app, right? I wasn't following somebody else's instructions. So I had to dive into the documentation, or maybe I did follow a tutorial, but I could only take bits and pieces from it because it wasn't, you know, exactly what I needed. Anyway, long story short, if you find yourself in this tutorial trap and feel stuck, like you can't build anything on your own, you have to follow a tutorial, the only way out of that is to start building stuff on your own. It's going to be rough at first, but trust me, your learning will go through the roof. The next thing I want to talk about is to not, skim over the fundamentals of the language to move on to the fun stuff, if you will, right? Really drill those fundamentals. It's like playing a sport, right? If you're trying to learn how to shoot a basketball, you're going to shoot thousands and thousands of shots. You're just not going to go right into playing a game. Well, you shouldn't go right into playing a game when you've only shot a couple shots, right? So same thing with the fundamentals of not only the language, but of, iOS, speaking from an iOS developer specifically. Like I use table views as an example. You can't just build one table view and think you're good to go on table views onto the next thing, right? You just got to drill it. It's like shooting 1,000 jump shots, like I said. I know table views so well, it's because I built 1,000 of them, right? You're not just going to build one and then know it cold. So drill the fundamentals, not only of the language, but of the platform as well. My next piece of advice would be to not worry about memorizing things. It doesn't matter how senior of a developer you are, you're probably going to Google the simplest of things each and every day. Like it just happens to all of us. The key here is to know where to look for it, where to find the information you want, whether that's documentation, a certain blog post, etc. But don't worry about being able to. I think people starting out have this misconception that senior developers just sit in front of their computer, just type away, for an hour without looking something up. They just do it all from their head. That is absolutely not the case. I mentioned table views earlier, even though, sure, I can create the pretty typical standard table view, but if you do anything with like dynamic cell height or maybe section headers, that kind of stuff, I'm gonna be like, oh, I can't remember how to do that exactly. Let me look that up real quick. Again, you have this misconception that we just sit there and just type away for hours, never looking anything up. Couldn't be further from the truth. So the key here is to kind of learn how to learn and then also know where to find this stuff. Don't worry about memorizing. Next up, I want to talk about finding a mentor. Now, this doesn't necessarily have to be somebody in person. If you live in a remote place where there's not a lot of developers, it can be online via Twitter, etc., or online coaching. Some people offer that. I don't know who, but just find somebody who earlier in your career can help guide you and coach you and get you over those hurdles. I know when I first started out, I didn't really have this for the first year of my career. And when I got stuck, I'd be stuck for days. And it was, not only did it slow me down, but it was discouraging, right? Nobody likes to be stuck for days on a simple problem when you can reach out to a mentor and just say, hey, can you explain closures to me real quick? I say that because closures hang up a lot of people. And then having somebody, a mentor, explain that to you can help get you over that hurdle and back on your way. Again, that'll speed you up and you'll spend less time being discouraged, which the more time you spend being discouraged, the more likely you are to quit and not complete this journey of becoming a software developer. My next piece of advice is I would start diving into the documentation of not only your language, but the platform, whichever you're working on, iOS, web, Android, whatever, as soon as possible. Kind of like I said before, many of us start off doing tutorials and that's how we start learning. But like I said, once you can be self-sufficient and not rely on a cookie cutter tutorial, you can say, hey, I want to build this certain aspect. And then you go to the documentation around, that aspect of the platform. You can dig in and you can figure it out for your own. Now you're self-sufficient, and that's how you really get things done. That's how you get out of that tutorial trap that I mentioned earlier. And now you're on your own, building your own ideas, and you're on your way. So the documentation, I know, can be a little daunting, especially in the iOS Swift world. It's not exactly straightforward. And I get tons of requests for, hey, can you do a video on how to read the documentation? But I've thought about how I would do this, but truthfully, it's one of those things where you just got to dive in, and it sucks, but it just gets better and easier over time. You kind of got to go through that learning curve. So fortunately, there's no magic bullet here, but just dive in as soon as possible, and you'll get through that rough patch and be out the other side faster than you know it. The next advice is that you have to love it. Luckily, I do love it, but I talk to a lot of beginner programmers who are inexperienced or just getting started, and truthfully, they do it for the money, right? We all know software developers get paid pretty well, and that's the only reason they do it. They don't do it because they love to solve problems, or they don't do it because they love to build or create things, right? That's the reason you should be doing it, is because you love the fact that you can take an idea in your head, type on a keyboard with those colored text back there, and then something magical pops up on a phone. Like, if that is just so enticing to you, you're in it for the right reasons. And again, you just have to love this because, kind of like I mentioned earlier, you're going to run into rough patches. You're going to hit roadblocks. And if you don't love it, those roadblocks are going to knock you down and you're probably going to give up. However, if you love it, you're going to kind of take those challenges head on, plow through those roadblocks, and be on your way. And newsflash, those roadblocks don't go away. Doesn't matter how senior you are, how long you've been doing this, technology's always changing. Something new is going to come out. AR kit, AR glasses, VR, whatever. And you're going to have to learn all over again. So if you don't love the process of learning and solving problems and building and creating, it's going to be a rough road. So again, you have to love this. Building on that, because I just kind of talked about how rough it can be, but it does get easier, and here's why. As you go through your career, like, it's going to seem super daunting that there's all these possibilities of apps you can build. However, as you go through your career, whether it's contracting, working at other companies, you're going to be building various different apps. And when you build these apps, you're going to have these code bases on your hard drive. So you'll have access to previous code you've written to use in future projects. Now, I'm not saying you're just going to copy and paste that code, but let's say you built a fully fleshed out custom camera screen, and then 2 years later, you're going to build another camera app, and you're like, oh, I've done that before. Let me go back. And again, you're not going to copy and paste it, but you're going to have a lot of the heavy lifting has already been done for you. So what I've found, I've built probably now 10 production apps between contracting and startups. Over time, I have built many, many features that can be done on an iPhone. So whenever I come across something tricky, I know that I can always go back to, I call it my toolbox. I can always go back to my toolbox of code, see what I've done before, and pull from there. And again, a lot of times the heavy lifting has been done, and I just got to tweak it or add some little stuff. So it does get easier the longer you do it. And then, as always, I want to preach patience. Again, so many people reach out to me and say, how can I become an iOS developer as fast as possible? And right away, like, you already have the wrong mindset. Like, this is such a marathon. It's not a sprint. It is a very, very long journey. And if you're just trying to get there as fast as possible, all the other stuff I talked about earlier in the video is really going to come and bite you in the ass. So just be patient, and don't compare yourself to somebody else as well. Like, this happens to me sometimes, right? I've been doing this for about 4 years, and I look at developers who've been doing it for like 8, and I'm like, oh man, I'm not as good as them. It's like, they've been doing it twice as long as you. So it's hard to compare yourself to other developers. You're on your own journey. It's going to take a while. And like I said before, if you love it, you're determined, you're going to get there. Just keep plugging away. But just patience is the key. If software development was so easy that you could learn it in 2 months, everybody would be doing it. The market would be oversaturated, and it wouldn't be such a coveted position. So have patience. It'll pay off in the long run. And then finally, probably my most important piece of advice, I've said this time and time again, get involved in Twitter ASAP. It took me 2 years to finally start interacting in iOS conversations on Twitter, and I just kick myself all the time. This sounds like a bold statement, but I would say Twitter is the most important tool for my developer career. Just the people I've met, the developers at other companies I've gotten to know and meet through Twitter, it's amazing. And I can really only speak for the Swift community, but the iOS and Swift community is amazing on Twitter, super helpful. I know Twitter may have a bad rap for some of you, but Twitter has like a lot of different types, right? Like there's sports Twitter, financial Twitter, software developer Twitter, at least in the Swift world, is amazing. Obviously, like political Twitter is probably a cesspool, but developer Twitter, great. This is a big part of how networking is done in the software developer world. You interact on Twitter. Next thing you know, you meet somebody at a conference and they know you because you've been interacting on Twitter. Anyway, I could go on for days, and I did in this video. Check it out. But Twitter is so valuable for a developer, and I wasted 2 years being scared to jump into a conversation. Don't do that. Start right away, and you'll be happy you did. So those are the 9 things I wish I knew before I became a software developer. Hope some of that helped you out. If you like what I'm doing here, I put out a show called Swift News every Monday and a tutorial or 2 throughout the week. We'll see you in the next video. What's up, everybody? Today's video is going to be all about building your confidence as a software developer. Now, we've all heard of imposter syndrome. We've probably all experienced imposter syndrome, but this video really stems from this tweet here from Alfonso that says, how do you gain confidence as a developer? I feel very confident in myself as a person, but as a developer, not so much at times. And I'm going to link to this tweet in the description. There's like 40-something responses to this thread. Great stuff. I picked out a few of the responses, and I want to talk about some of these topics on how to build your confidence. Just to give some quick context on Alfonso here, I've been interacting with him on Twitter and in the YouTube comments for well over a year now. I've actually met him at a startup. He's been working on becoming a self-taught iOS developer for a long time now, and recently just got his first job. So hooray, congratulations, Alfonso. But that's the context around this tweet. He's just now starting his first job, and the confidence is shaken a little bit. Now, the first 2 responses I want to touch on are from Zach and Corey. And Zach says, write code, then keep writing code. When you're finished writing, talk about code, then write some more code. It's all a process, the more you do it, etc. And the point Zach touches on that I want to elaborate on is just this concept of immersion that I always talk about with people like learning development. Just completely immerse yourself and soak up as much knowledge as you can, whether that's YouTube videos, books, podcasts, blogs, like just completely immerse yourself in this world. And the more you do that, just over time, like knowledge is power. You're just going to increase your knowledge just day by day by day by day. And just over time, like the more you know, the more confident you'll become. And then Corey says, for me, it's looking back at how I didn't know a single thing about code and now have an app in the App Store. I remind myself of the steps I've taken, even if they are small. I have to remind myself that in time I will get better and better, but if I quit, no progress. And that builds on what Zach says, and what I want to touch on is just the concept of patience. Yes, I mentioned immersion a little bit ago, but you can't just immerse yourself and 3 days later be confident in all your knowledge, right? It's going to take time. So just knowing in the back of your head that this is a long, multi-year journey. That might not, give you the confidence, but that will help you deal with that feeling of lack of confidence. Know that everybody started out, as a beginner at one point. So just know that this is your journey. It's going to take time. The next response here from David Cacho, it might be my favorite one because I think it resonates with me the most. And it says, the single best way to gain confidence is to acknowledge you won't know everything as a developer, but that you know where to find anything you don't know. This will get you through anything every time. And I always say the biggest thing as a developer is you need to learn how to learn, right? Because like David says, it's impossible to know everything about every development language or every framework within that language, etc. You just can't know that stuff. But if you know how to learn, that will boost your confidence, because like I know that's kind of where I'm at is, say I go to a company that works with ARKit and they're building an augmented reality app. I've never built an ARKit app, but I'm not worried about that because I know that I will, again, back to the first, responses, I would completely immerse myself, and given, a few weeks in time, I'll be caught up to speed and I'll be good to go. So the reason I have confidence there is because I know how to learn things, I'm confident in myself that I will pick it up quickly. So again, I will work on that skill. If you want to build your confidence, learning how to learn might be the most important skill as a developer. Next up, we have a good one from Andy Hope that says, I suggest avoiding comparing yourself to others. We're all at different positions in our journey. With enough perseverance, you will get to where you want to be in due time. Be humble with what you've learned, be proud, and be curious, and be you. So the message here is don't compare yourselves to others. Like, you're on your own path. There's a nice saying that I love. It's called comparison is the thief of joy. Just do you, be on your own path, and don't worry about like, oh, this person knows more than I do. Like, you don't know their history. You may be self-taught. You wrote your first line of code 3 years ago. They may have been coding since they were 12, right? That's not a fair comparison. So don't compare yourself to other people. You're on your own journey. Next up, I want to talk about Mark Opont's response. A little fun fact about Mark: he was the first ever guest on Origin Stories, my podcast. Got to get the plug in, you know? But anyway, Mark says, you gain confidence by working around people that build you up and allow you to fail gracefully. Also build projects and build small, work on small tasks, etc. Really what I wanted to focus on with Mark's response is, gaining confidence by working around people that build you up and allow you to fail gracefully. Because really what I want to elaborate on is your environment is so important, right? Don't get me wrong, I know oftentimes if you're trying to get that first job, you may not have a lot of choices on where you go, but if you are fortunate enough to have any choice, my opinion is to always judge the quality of team first. Like, a lot of people go for the biggest salary, and to me, salary is like third or fourth on the list of importance, and team is number one. Think about it. You work with these people every day, 8, 9, 10 hours, however long you work, whatever. You spend more time with them than you do your family. So your environment that you build is going to have a major effect on your confidence, your career, and just that vital, first year of your career. Having a good team that really boosts you up and good mentors, that can just, shoot you off exponentially on an amazing career. Vice versa, if you're in a very toxic environment, that can just really depress you and put you down and can really affect the whole rest of your career. So again, I want to stress what Mark is saying here is your environment is super important, and that can really help with your confidence. Or even if you are a confident person and you go into a toxic environment, that can like remove your confidence. So pay attention to your environment. Next up, we got a good response from Jordan here. It says, reflection. Look back on where you started and where you are now. Like, try to get 1% better every day. That's a very common saying. But basically what he says is just have context and perspective on how far you've actually come. Like, this really resonates with me because I was a self-taught developer, 4 years ago, did a boot camp and have been on my way. But it's just like, anytime I was lacking confidence, it's like, man, you didn't even know how to code 4 years ago. Like, now look where you're at. It's good to keep that in perspective, how far you've actually come, and be like, yeah, I got this. And then, this is all building on previous answers. You're on your own journey. Like, don't compare yourself to others. Like, and just, again, perspective is the big key here. You've come a long way. And the next comment I want to talk about is from Sky Brown. And she says, I think building something from the ground up by myself is a huge confidence builder. Being able to accomplish something independently and figure things out on my own makes me feel like a real developer. And this was a major turning point in my career and my confidence as well, as when I built my first app on my own. I think what a lot of people can fall into, especially when they're just learning how to code or just getting started, you fall into what I call the tutorial trap, where all you do is just build tutorials, follow everybody's instructions. Sure, you've built 3, 4, 5 apps, but like, they're not your apps. You just followed a recipe, so to speak, which, don't get me wrong, you have to do that in the beginning. Like, that's how you learn. But what happens with people is they stay in that comfort zone way too long. And really what you should do to get out of that tutorial trap, think of your own app, think of your own idea, and build it on your own. Build it yourself. Don't get me wrong, you can look at references to help you build it, but you're not following a tutorial, you're building your own idea. And when I did that, I think my learning jumped up exponentially, because a lot of stuff I was doing, there wasn't a specific tutorial for. So what did I have to do? I had to dig into the documentation. I had to figure out, and I'm not gonna lie, it was hard as hell. Like, it took forever, took a long time. It was a struggle, but at the same time, I learned a ton doing it. And when I got out through the other side, my confidence level was just high, because again, like I talked about earlier, I started learning how to learn, and that's just a huge thing. And then finally, I want to end this on this one from Getify. He says, 20 plus years experience as a developer. He's got 8 books with over 100,000 copies sold, 300 hours of videos watched, 4,000 people taught in person. Very accomplished developer, right? And he says, and you know what? I still struggle to get my code to work, and it's still a tedious slog, and my code still confuses me the next day. What he's saying here is just, we all deal with this stuff. Like, no matter how experienced you are, you're going to deal with this. And I really like what he says, though, because it resonates with me. I have 200 plus YouTube videos out there. I can't tell you how many times I refer to my own video to implement something relatively simple, right? Because like we mentioned earlier, it's impossible to memorize everything. You're not going to know, but if you know where to look and know where to figure it out, you're good. That's all you need to know. But again, the moral of this comment here is to just keep it in perspective. No matter how experienced you are, we all deal with this stuff, like the lack of confidence or confusing code or having to look up the most simple things. Like, no matter how experienced you are, you still do that. So that's a few ways to build your confidence as a software developer. Thank you, Alfonso, for your tweet and letting me use that. And then also anybody that responded in the comments. Great stuff, very valuable. Again, check out the tweet. Link will be in the description. If you like what I'm doing here, I put out Swift news every Monday and a tutorial or two throughout the week. See you in the next one. What's going on, everybody? Today we're going to talk about a software development concept that really only sinks in once you have experience. And there's not really an official name for it, but I call it the 90-90 rule. Now again, this will usually only bite you in the ass as a new developer when you're building your first app or your first product. And that is the concept that there's the first 90% of the app, and then there's the second 90% of the app. And you're thinking, wait a minute, 180%? What are you talking about? Like, what the hell does that mean? We'll talk about it. So here's typically what happens when you're building your first app, first website, first software development product. You're going to build that core functionality first. So when you have all that done, the app is going to feel like it's 90% done. You're going to be able to play with it, do all the main functions that you want, and it's going to be like, wow, this app's ready to go almost. Just, it's 90% done. Just got a little bit of polish to go, and we're done. Ship it. But that's where you'd be wrong. You see, that was just the first 90%. And even though it feels almost done, you're really only about halfway done. And that's where the second 90% comes in. And that's all this little stuff where each thing on its own doesn't really seem like that big a deal, but they all add up to a lot of work actually. And that's why when you get to that first 90% point, you're really only halfway done. And the reason I want to talk about this and bring this up to you newer developers is that it can be very discouraging. I remember building my first app. It was discouraging as hell. It was frustrating. Like I felt like I was almost done. This thing's ready to ship. And then it's just all this little stuff just keeps piling up. And we're going to talk about that little stuff later. But I wanted to share this concept so you know this going into building your first app, or if you're already midway through, you can kind of expect this. Because what happens is, again, once you get that first 90% done, you think you're done or close to being done, and then you just get smacked in the face by the second 90%. So I'm trying to forewarn you and let you know that second 90% is coming. So let's talk about that second 90% that's about to smack you in the face, and we'll talk about some of the things that it can typically be. Now, if you're here watching this and you're not an iOS developer, that's what my channel focuses on, is Swift and iOS development. So these examples are going to be from that perspective, but you can apply it, to your own process. But let's talk about edge cases here. Now, this can be anything from how does your app perform when there's no internet or very, very poor internet connection, right? You got to handle all of that. What happens when a user gets a brand new device? Are you relying on storing some stuff in user defaults too much? Or if they delete the app and reinstall, is your app still going to behave properly? Or things like what happens when a user kills your app in the middle of a key function that's going on? Or is your app going to be able to recover from that gracefully, or is it just going to be in this weird state that's broken, right? So you see, basically what really happens here is you think you know how users are going to use your app, but really once it gets out in the wild and users start banging on your app, they're going to do things you could never even think of. So all these edge cases, you have to try and think of that in advance. And like I said, these small things really add up and do some time-consuming, fixes. And those were just some common general edge cases. These edge cases are going to be very specific to your app, but they really add up. Next up, let's talk about some really robust error handling, right? When we're initially developing our app, how common is it to be like, handle the errors, and you'll do that later, right? Because it's tedious work, because you got to handle all the various different error messages and fail gracefully like we do in our apps, right? You don't want to just have an abrupt error that's not descriptive. You want to let the user know what's going on so they know what happened with your app and so forth. So building out really robust error handling is tedious and time consuming, but it has to be done. And again, it's one of those things where on its own, it may not seem that bad, but when you pile on error handling with edge cases and all the other stuff we're going to talk about, again, you can start to see where this second 90%, again, it adds up. And then you have things like just overall analytics, right? You want to see how many times users are going to a specific screen or how many times they're doing a specific function. So now you gotta, once the app's done, you gotta put in your analytics so you can track everything. And then there's accessibility features for people with disabilities. And this is often overlooked by many developers, but it's so important. I've covered it on Swift News a few times. Just the percentage of people that use the iPhone that actually use these accessibility features. It's a big deal, and if you're ignoring accessibility, stop. You shouldn't. And then you got testing your UI on all the many device sizes here in the iOS ecosystem. Now, don't get me wrong, if you're using auto layout correctly, that's going to handle 80 to 90% of the work in my opinion. However, making your app look beautiful on the iPhone XS Max, yes I said XS, and then down to the iPhone SE size, like that's a massive difference. And like I said, a lot of times auto layout will do most of the work, but most of the time you got to tweak that final 10% to get it really looking perfect on both screens. And like I said in the beginning, when you're building the original functionality of your app going through the first time, you're not worried about making it look great on all screen sizes while you're still building it and trying to get it to work, right? You kind of save that for the end once you're ready for the polish. But again, now we're just piling more stuff up onto that second 90% that we're talking about. And then there's the good old refactoring. How many times have you built a feature, refactor this later when you have more time, right? Because oftentimes in software development, you just hack it together to get it working, and then you clean it up later. Well, sometimes, depending on any deadlines, you might not get to that cleanup, which is, don't get me wrong, I'm not advocating that. That's bad. Always try to refactor and make your code good before moving on to the next thing. But I know shit happens, and sometimes you don't have the chance to do that. But eventually you got to pay the piper, and again, during the second 90% is usually when you clean up a lot of technical debt and do a lot of refactoring. And then there's testing. Depending on your philosophy, if you're doing test-driven development, then you're doing the test first, so this won't be in the second 90%. But most people don't do test-driven development. I'm not knocking it. I'm just saying the majority of developers don't do that. So now your unit tests come in after you've built the app. So again, more stuff in the second 90%. So those were just some examples of what can be in that second 90% that just comes in and smack you in the face. But I wanted to share this because the main takeaway I want you to take away from this video is know that second 90% is coming, and don't be blindsided by it, and don't get discouraged. If you're building your very first app, or if you're a junior developer, I want to get you in the right mindset to expect a whole lot of work to still be needed to be done when you think you're almost done. Again, there's the first 90% and the second 90%. So that's what I got for you today. If you like what I'm doing here, consider subscribing. I put out Swift news every Monday and then a tutorial or two throughout the week. We'll see you in the next one.